The filthy office atmosphere changed forever when the most popular vermin in the building made a sudden announcement. Assistant manager Yun Sara stood before her stunned colleagues and shared the news that she would be resigning to get married. While the boss looked like he was about to faint, the rest of the staff struggled to process the massive void she was leaving behind. Sarah offered a bright smile and a final wish for everyone to stay in good health before making her graceful exit, unaware of the trail of broken hearts she left in her wake. The reality of her absence hit the company like a tidal wave almost immediately. Without Sarah there to manage the chaos, clients began calling in a never-ending flood that completely overwhelmed the remaining staff. In the middle of this disaster, the office felt less like a workplace and more like a battleground. One particularly frustrated manager, who seemed to transform into a literal demon in Inchul's imagination, took her anger out on him for every minor mistake. As she screamed about payment forms and his lack of focus, Inchul realized that his misery was fueled by more than just a heavy workload. He was mourning a one-sided love that he had never even attempted to pursue. Eventually, the pressure became too much for Inchul to handle. He stood before his exhausted team leader and informed her that he was also resigning, which only added another headache to her growing list of problems. Not long after, he found himself sitting on the floor of a messy apartment, surrounded by trash bags and empty bottles. The drink he swallowed burned his throat, but the sting of regret in his heart was even worse. He spent his days in a daze, wondering why he had never found the courage to tell Sarah how he felt when he had the chance. His mind often drifted back to the quiet nights they spent working overtime together. He remembered one specific evening when he had convinced himself that the perfect moment for a confession had finally arrived. He had approached her with a small drink in his hand, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. He managed to hand her the bottle, but as she offered a polite thank you, his courage evaporated instantly. Instead of declaring his feelings, he made up a silly excuse about needing to organize a list and bolted out of the room. He spent the rest of that night calling himself an absolute idiot for running away like a frightened rabbit. Even his social life offered no escape from his thoughts. On another occasion, he sat with a friend and repeated the same sad story of his unrequited feelings. His friend was visibly annoyed, noting that it was no surprise since Inchul had never actually been with anyone in his life. Back in the present, a sudden vibration on the floor broke his self-pity. His eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw a private message from Sarah. She had heard that he quit his job and wanted to thank him for everything. She wrote that he had been a beacon of light for her during her difficult times at the company, which made Inchul wonder what he could have possibly done to earn such a high compliment. However, the message ended with a confusing realization, as she stated they could no longer meet and wished for his happiness. Determined to understand the hidden meaning behind her cryptic words, Inchul decided to seek guidance from a local shaman. He entered the traditional building, expecting a quiet consultation, but was instead met with an immediate verbal assault. The woman inside began shouting at him, calling him a brat, and demanding to know why he had thrown away his career. Inchul fell backward in total shock, struggling to understand how this stranger already knew his business and wondering what kind of strange situation he had just walked into. The shaman continued her lecture with an air of authority, snapping her red fan shut and wondering if the young man truly had any idea about the situation he was in. She explained with great intensity that his old company had been filled with a specific kind of energy and that his presence there had been absolutely necessary. Inchul tried to argue that he was just a simple travel agent, but she silenced him with a dismissive clicking of her tongue. She spoke in riddles about a spider waiting in the web and claimed that his arrival at the company was actually a blessing from above. However, she warned him that, because he had failed to act in time, he was now trapped without an escape. The atmosphere in the small room grew even more tense as she tossed a handful of rice across the table to read his fortune. Her face turned grim as she delivered a shocking prediction that one of the women would soon face a terrible fate. Inchul sat in stunned silence, his mind racing to figure out who she was talking about, but the shaman insisted that he listen quietly until she was finished. She mentioned that the gods had granted him a small piece of good fortune from a previous life, giving him one last opportunity to fix his mistakes. Before he could ask for details, she suddenly whacked him over the head with her heavy fan, claiming she was transferring a burst of energy into him to help him do better this time around. Everything went dark until Inchul slowly opened his eyes while lying in bed, feeling a lingering sensation from the blow, even though he was convinced it was just a strange dream. He stared up at the ceiling and sighed with relief, thinking he was back in his normal life, but the feeling of unease refused to go away. As he sat up and looked around, he noticed something impossible that made his heart skip a beat. The old coffee pot he was certain he had thrown away was sitting on the counter, and a wardrobe he had replaced years ago was standing perfectly in the corner. He realized with a jolt of panic that the room looked exactly as it did 3 years in the past. His confusion only deepened when he spotted an old smartphone lying on the floor. He picked it up with shaking hands and pressed the power button, only to see a date that confirmed his wildest suspicions. The screen displayed the 25th of June, 2020. which was famously his very first day at the company. For a moment, he wondered if his mind was playing a cruel trick on him, or if he was trapped in some kind of elaborate time-traveling dream. Regardless of the logic behind it, he decided that if this was truly a second chance, he wasn't going to spend it hiding under his blankets. Driven by a sudden surge of adrenaline, Inchul threw on his old suit and bolted out of the apartment. He sprinted through the morning streets with a desperate smile on his face, ignoring the confused looks from pedestrians as he dashed toward his old office. His mind was focused on one person, and he realized that if the calendar was correct, he would be able to see assistant manager Sarah again before she ever left. He arrived at the building completely out of breath and drenched in sweat, looking like he had just survived a major workout in professional attire. Just as he reached the hallway, he skidded to a stop and found himself face to face with the woman who had haunted his thoughts for years. Sarah stood there holding a folder, looking surprised by the disheveled man standing before her. Inchul struggled to catch his breath, but the sight of her actually being there made all the exhaustion worth it. He realized that the shaman had been telling the truth, and that he had officially landed back at the very beginning of his journey. Even with sweat dripping down his face, he offered a bright and hopeful smile, knowing that this time he had the chance to change everything. Inchul stood in front of Sarah and offered a cheerful greeting, but his heart nearly stopped when she stared back at him with total confusion. He realized with a jolt that in this new timeline, he was nothing more than a complete stranger to the woman of his dreams. In a frantic attempt to seem normal, he stumbled over his words and claimed that he had simply memorized the names of every team member before his first day. Sarah accepted the strange explanation with a polite nod just as their supervisor, Sue, arrived on the scene to see what the commotion was about. The dynamic shifted immediately as Sarah introduced Inchul as the new hire to Sue, who was the same woman who would eventually become a nightmare to work for in his previous life. Right now, she was just an assertive senior employee, establishing her dominance and making sure everyone knew she would soon be promoted to an advisor role. Inchul felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized he had already messed up the office hierarchy by having the marketing chief introduce him instead of the manager. Sue didn't waste any time and began a stern orientation, emphasizing that she valued the professional relationship between superiors and subordinates above all else. As they walked through the office, Sue provided a serious warning about the high number of women working at the agency, telling Inchul that any approach with bad intentions would be extremely risky for his career. Inchul followed along quietly, noting that the colleagues he was meeting, like the trip planner Yiju, were just as blunt and busy as he remembered them being. He felt a sense of déjà vu as he looked around at the familiar faces, realizing that he was surrounded by the same people who would eventually witness his professional downfall. Despite the rough start, Inchul decided it was time to put his future knowledge to good use during the lunch break. He saw Sarah resting her head on her desk and decided to surprise her with a vanilla latte, which he knew was her favorite drink from his years of watching her from afar. He approached her with a wide, hopeful smile, thinking this thoughtful gesture would instantly improve his image in her eyes. However, the plan backfired spectacularly when Sarah looked at the cup with deep suspicion and wondered out loud how a new hire could possibly know her specific coffee preferences. The air in the office grew thick with awkwardness as Sarah told him to take the drink back, her face showing clear signs that she found his behavior more creepy than charming. Inchul slunk away in total defeat, realizing that knowing someone's secrets before actually meeting them was a quick way to look like a suspicious character. To make matters worse, his attempt to play favorites had been watched by Sue, who was not at all impressed that her trainee was ignoring his work to buy drinks for the chief. She approached his desk with her arms crossed and a look of pure irritation, deciding that if he had enough energy to run errands for other departments, he definitely had enough energy to start working on Excel spreadsheets immediately. Sue decided it was time to put the new guy to work, dumping a massive pile of list management on his desk. She assumed that surely he didn't show up for a job at a travel agency without knowing how to handle a complex Excel spreadsheet. She handed him a messy price table for vacation packages and told him to get it organized as his first real test. Inchul didn't even blink, his fingers flying across the keys with a speed that defied logic. He collected the data and polished the charts so quickly that he was finished before his boss could even settle back into her chair. When Inchul asked if there was anything else he needed to do, Sue was visibly shaken by his level of competence. She found herself wondering why a rookie was already more skilled at office work than she was. She tried to hide her shock behind a stern face, telling him he didn't need to do anything else for the moment. Inchul just offered a polite smile, knowing full well that his skills came from 3 years of her constant nagging and correction in his previous life. Sue felt a strange mix of irritation and respect, warning him not to get too full of himself just because he could handle a few numbers. She then reminded him about the company welcome dinner, making it clear that his attendance was not optional. Later that evening, the team gathered at a noisy restaurant for a night of grilled meat and drinks. Inchul decided to use his future knowledge to win over the higher-ups, serving a specific cut of pork cheek to the department head. The older man was absolutely delighted, wondering how a brand new hire already knew about his favorite local delicacies. Everyone at the table was impressed by his attention to detail, but Sue watched him with growing curiosity. She became even more puzzled when he bypassed the beer and poured her a glass of soju instead. She couldn't understand how he knew her drinking preferences on their very first day together. Inchul quickly made up a story about how she hadn't touched the beer yet, hoping that would be enough to cover his tracks. As he led a round of cheers, Sue found herself thinking that he was a truly interesting person. She had expected him to be a clumsy beginner who would take weeks to adjust, but instead, he was a diligent worker who knew exactly how to set the mood of a party. Inchul felt a surge of confidence, realizing that those 3 years of experience were finally paying off. He was ready to make his move and sit next to Sarah, certain that his smooth performance had cleared a path to her heart. However, his plans were cut short when Sarah suddenly stood up and reached for her bag. She apologized and announced that she would be heading home early, leaving the entire table in a state of surprise. Inchul watched her walk away in absolute despair, realizing that he hadn't managed to say a single meaningful word to her the entire night. He stood outside the restaurant later that night, feeling like a total failure despite all his hard work. Just as he was preparing to trudge home and wallow in his disappointment, Sue approached him from behind. She noted that they hadn't gotten a chance to talk properly and suggested that the two of them head out for another round together. Inchul was left standing there in shock, realizing that while he was chasing Sarah, he might have accidentally made a very strong impression on someone else. Sue seemed to be enjoying the second round of drinks much more than the first. She happily sipped her beverage while Inchul watched, noticing how much more relaxed she looked away from the constant pressure of the office. When he tried to perform his junior duties by pouring her another glass, she stopped him and suggested a complete change in their dynamic. Since they were actually the same age, she told him he should just relax and speak to her comfortably instead of sticking to formal protocols. She admitted that her early days at the company had been incredibly lonely because she lacked anyone her own age to share her thoughts with. Inchul was stunned to see this hidden, vulnerable side of her that he had never suspected existed during his first life. However, the moment of warmth did not last long before she snapped back into her role as a stern superior. She reminded him that if he wanted to be a proper employee, he needed to start acting like one immediately. Inchul scrambled to fix his posture and tone, realizing that being her coworker meant constantly balancing on a very thin line between friendship and professionalism. He reflected on how these small glimpses into her true personality had originally made him look at her differently and encouraged him to approach her more often. In the present moment, he raised his glass for a final toast, and Sue found herself thinking that this new hire was becoming more interesting by the minute. She had expected a clumsy beginner, but he seemed to know exactly how to handle himself in any situation. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Inchul tried to offer payment for the meal, but Sue brushed him off instantly. She reminded him that as his senior, it was only right for her to take care of the bill. To clear the fog from their heads, she suggested they take a little walk before heading home for the night. Inchul felt a surge of confidence, realizing that his 3 years of previous experience were finally paying off in ways he had never expected. As they walked together through the quiet streets, he decided to stop playing it safe and finally took the sussy initiative to bridge the gap between them. To his absolute delight, his bold move was met with an enthusiastic sussy response, proving that this second chance at life was going much better than he had ever hoped. Then they started a cardio session in a private place. Inchul opened his eyes to the soft light of a new morning, half expecting his world to have returned to its boring old routine while he slept. As he sat up in bed to the sound of sparrows chirping outside, he slowly realized that his surroundings were anything but familiar. He found himself in the middle of a room that definitely was not his apartment, and the sudden realization that he was in a room made his heart race. He scrambled to his feet, trying to piece together the blurry events of the previous night, while struggling to figure out if he was still trapped in a very elaborate dream. He looked around for any sign of Sue, but the room was empty and eerily quiet. A quick glance at his phone sent another shock through his system as the screen displayed the morning of the 26th of June, 2020. It was only the second day of his time travel adventure, and the clock was ticking dangerously close to 9. Realizing that his second chance at life was very much real and that he was about to be late for work, he rushed to get his suit back on and headed straight for the office. He arrived at the company building feeling a bit sluggish, letting out a massive yawn as the elevator doors slid open. His eyes widened when he saw Sue walking toward him in the hallway, looking remarkably composed given the circumstances of their late-night outing. He could not help but notice that she was wearing the exact same outfit from the night before, which confirmed his suspicion that their encounter had been more than just a dream. A smug smile crept onto his face as he realized that he had actually spent the cardio night with his tough superior on his very first day back. Inchul tried to play it cool by greeting her with a casual grin and asking why she had decided to sneak away so early that morning. His confidence was shattered instantly when she stopped in her tracks and fixed him with an icy glare that could freeze a volcano. She reminded him in a sharp and professional tone that they were currently in a place of business and that he needed to use proper, respectful language when addressing her. Inchul was left stammering in confusion as she turned on her heel and walked away without looking back, leaving him to wonder if he had imagined the cardio technique she showed him the night before. As he stood alone in the middle of the office floor, he had to admit that this time travel situation was far more complicated than he had anticipated. It made absolutely no logical sense, yet there he was, living through his past with all his future memories intact. His gaze eventually drifted across the room to assistant manager Sarah, who was diligently working at her desk. Seeing her there reminded him of his original mission, and he allowed himself to believe that this strange journey back in time might finally give him the chance to get together with her and change his destiny forever. Inchul sat at his desk and stared at nothing, as his brain struggled to process the sheer absurdity of his situation. He was definitely 3 years in the past, but the script for his perfect redo was already being shredded by his own hands. While his heart was still firmly set on assistant manager Sarah, his late-night cardio activities with his boss, Sue, had created a massive complication he never saw coming. He realized he could not simply hit a delete button on his memory of the previous night, especially when it involved someone as intense as Sue. The thought of juggling his feelings for the sweet Sarah while being secretly involved with the office demon made him want to bury his head in his keyboard. He found himself trapped in a mental loop, wondering how he could possibly pursue his dream woman when he was already tangled in a very messy reality with his superior. As Inchul sat there looking like a man who had just seen a ghost, Sarah was watching him from across the room with a growing sense of guilt. She noticed how incredibly tense he looked and assumed that his misery was entirely her fault. She felt terrible for being so cold to him during the coffee incident and worried that she had crushed the spirit of the poor new hire on his very first day. She tried to shake off the feeling and focus on her payment forms, but the sight of him looking so defeated kept tugging at her conscience. She eventually gathered her documents and headed toward the management office, still feeling a lingering sense of regret for her behavior. The universe decided to intervene when Sarah's legendary grace failed her for a split second, causing her to drop a stack of important papers right in front of Inchul's desk. He immediately snapped out of his trance and knelt down to help her gather the scattered sheets. As he picked up the forms, his future knowledge kicked in like a well-timed cheat code. He noticed that the report was missing the previous year's statistics, which was a specific detail that their meticulous team leader always demanded. He didn't even stop to think before pointing out the error, suggesting that she should include the old data to make the current situation easier to compare. Sarah was momentarily stunned that a rookie could spot a flaw in her work so quickly, but she decided to trust his oddly specific intuition. Not long after, Sarah stood before team leader Hiren, a woman known for having high standards and a very low tolerance for mistakes. Hiren flipped through the updated folder with a sharp eye, searching for any reason to be critical. To Sarah's absolute surprise, the stern leader actually offered a compliment, noting that the data was organized perfectly and was exceptionally easy to read. Sarah was flooded with relief as she realized that Inchul's advice had saved her from a potential lecture. She left the office with a bright smile, feeling a sudden surge of gratitude for the strange new employee who seemed to know exactly what the bosses wanted. Back at his desk, Inchul was still wallowing in his own confusion when a cold drink suddenly appeared in his field of vision. He looked up to see Sarah standing there with a fresh coffee from the cafe downstairs. She explained that her meeting had gone perfectly, thanks to his help, and that she wanted to show her appreciation. The atmosphere between them shifted instantly as she offered a sincere apology for being so sensitive the day before. She admitted that she had misunderstood his intentions and hoped they could move past the awkwardness. Inchul was left speechless as she gave him a warm look and suggested that they should try to get along from now on. Inchul took the drink with a blush, realizing that holding Sarah's favorite vanilla latte felt more like a trophy than a simple beverage. He felt a wave of genuine happiness as he looked at the cup, convinced that this small victory was a sign that his second chance at life was finally heading in the right direction. He savored the moment, feeling a deep sense of meaning in the fact that the woman of his dreams was finally treating him with a bit of warmth. Unbeknownst to the happy pair, Sue was watching the exchange from a distance with a look that could melt lead. She found it incredibly grating to see Inchul acting so charmingly with someone else while she was still dealing with the physical cardio aftermath of their time together. Seeking a moment of privacy, she retreated to the restroom, where she finally allowed herself to wince from the lingering soreness in her hips. She was filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief that Inchul could be so carefree and cheerful when she was still feeling the throbbing effects of the previous night. The irritating realization that she might have been nothing more than a temporary distraction for him made her blood boil, and she struggled to process why her new subordinate was being so friendly with another woman. As the sun began to set over the city and the office started to empty out, the department head offered a friendly wave and told everyone to head home safely. Inchul was eager to pack his bags and catch Sarah one last time before the day ended, hoping to turn their coffee moment into a proper goodbye. He felt a surge of confidence as he prepared to leave, thinking he could finally end his second day on a high note. However, his plans for a graceful exit were shattered when Sue appeared behind him like a silent and very annoyed shadow. She made it clear that a junior employee should not even think about heading home while his superior still had mountains of work to finish. Before he could offer a single excuse, she commanded him to follow her with an authority that left no room for argument. Inchul could only offer a defeated expression as he was led toward the quiet storage room, wondering what kind of trouble he had managed to get himself into this time. Sarah stood by her desk and watched the two of them disappear behind the heavy storage room door, her mind racing with confusion about why the new hire was being summoned into a private space so late in the evening. The storage room was a complete disaster area, and Sue wasted no time in pointing out the mountain of messy pamphlets left over from the company's last event. She told Inchul that it was his responsibility to get everything back in order and offered a smug little smile as she left him to his fate. Inchul stood there in total disbelief, realizing that his second chance at life had quickly turned into a high-stakes cleaning mission. He wondered how he always managed to end up in these situations, but he knew that complaining wouldn't get the job done any faster. Outside in the hallway, Sue was surprised to see that Sarah was still lingering at her desk. They exchanged a brief and professional goodbye as Sarah finally decided to call it a day. Sue went back to her workstation and tried to focus on her screen, but the ticking of the office clock felt louder than usual. She found herself growing increasingly conscious of Inchul working alone in the back, and her curiosity eventually got the better of her. She decided to head back to the storage room to see how the rookie was handling the pressure. When she stepped inside, she was met with a sight that made her jaw drop. Instead of the chaotic mess she had left behind, the room was now perfectly organized, with every file and pamphlet sorted into its proper place. Inchul had used his 3 years of future experience to finish a job that should have taken all night in a matter of minutes. He looked at her with a confident grin and explained that he had even taken the liberty of sorting the materials to make them easier to find later. Sue felt a strange surge of irritation as she realized this new hire was far more capable than he had any right to be. Instead of offering him a compliment, she decided to double down on her stern superior act. She began shouting at him for not organizing the pamphlets by specific locations, claiming that he lacked even the most basic common sense. She even gave him a sharp smack for his supposed incompetence, which left Inchul wondering why he was being punished for doing a great job. He tried to ignore the stinging and casually asked if Sarah had already left the building, which was the absolute worst thing he could have said at that moment. The mention of the chief's name sent Sue into a fit of pure jealousy. She grabbed him by the shirt and demanded to know why he was so worried about another woman when the two of them had just spent such an intense night together. She was fuming as she asked if their time together had meant absolutely nothing to him. Before Inchul could even blink, she pulled him into a very sussy moment, proving that her professional exterior was hiding some very complicated feelings. While the two of them were busy in the storage room, the department head was halfway home when he realized he had forgotten his urgent review materials. He let out a frustrated sigh and performed a sudden U-turn, heading back toward the office at high speed. Back in the storage room, the situation had escalated into a total blur of adrenaline and poor decisions. Inchul tried to suggest that they should stop their cardio session before someone saw them, but Sue was too caught up in the moment to listen. She assured him that everyone had already gone home and that there was no reason to worry about being caught. The universe decided to prove her wrong in the most spectacular way possible. Just as the chaos reached its peak, the door swung open to reveal a completely horrified Sarah. She had come back to the office for her own reasons, only to walk directly into a scene that was far more sussy than she ever wanted to see. Inchul was caught in a state of total sussiness and stood there in frozen panic, while a very unfortunate cardio mess landed right on Sarah's face and clothes. The department head continued his drive into the night, feeling a sense of relief that he hadn't turned back to the office since he assumed everyone had already left for the evening. He had no idea that his decision to keep driving spared him from witnessing the greatest disaster in the history of the travel agency. Inside the storage room, the air was thick, with a level of awkwardness that should not have been scientifically possible. Sarah stood frozen as she processed the messy reality on her face and clothes, her expression quickly shifting from total shock to absolute disgust. Inchul and Sue scrambled to fix their attire in a state of blind panic, looking like two deer caught in the brightest headlights imaginable. Sarah did not hold back her fury, stating that such a despicable act in a professional setting would absolutely not be overlooked. She left them with a stern warning to prepare themselves for the consequences, leaving Inchul convinced that his second chance at life had just been sent straight into a wood chipper. Back in his messy apartment, Inchul spent the night wallowing in a sea of self-pity and legitimate fear. He could not stop replaying the look of pure hatred in Sarah's eyes and wondered if he was destined to trade his office career for a prison cell. He felt like his entire existence had been set on fire, and as the night dragged on, he convinced himself that there was no way to recover from such a catastrophic failure. He lay on his floor in total despair, certain that his journey was finally over and that he had destroyed any hope of a happy future. The sound of a chirping alarm eventually broke his misery, but his heart nearly stopped when he glanced at his phone. The screen displayed the morning of the 25th of June, 2020. Once again, he sat up in total disbelief, struggling to understand how the universe had decided to hit the rewind button for a second time. His neighbors began pounding on the walls as he shouted in confusion, and he quickly apologized while trying to wrap his head around this impossible development. He realized that everything that had happened with Sua and the storage room disaster had been wiped clean, giving him a third chance to try and get things right. Driven by a mix of terror and determination, Inchul sprinted toward the company building as fast as his legs would carry him. He arrived at the office feeling completely drained, only to be met by the cold gaze of team leader Hiren. She expressed her disappointment that a new hire would show up late on his very first day and suggested that he should just head back home. Inchul was about to accept his defeat until she clarified that she was simply being dramatic and introduced him to the woman who would be handling his training. Assistant manager Sarah appeared looking as professional and graceful as ever, seemingly having no memory of the incident that had ruined her clothes in the previous timeline. Inchul felt a massive wave of relief wash over him as Hiren instructed Sarah to show him the ropes and introduce him to the rest of the staff. Sarah gave him a polite nod and told him to follow her. As Sarah led the way through the office, she expressed a sense of relief that the team leader had been relatively easy on Inchul during their first meeting. She explained that the boss had a particular hatred for excuses, so it was a major victory that the encounter ended without a long lecture. Sarah officially introduced herself with a bright smile, and Inchul found himself clenching his hands as the reality of his situation finally settled in. He realized that while his memories were intact, he was now back at square one with the woman of his dreams, and she had no idea about the strange journey they had shared in the other timelines. The tour continued as Sarah introduced him to the rest of the staff, starting with assistant manager Yiju, who seemed just as busy and blunt as ever. Inchul offered a polite bow, but his real challenge arrived when they approached Sue's desk. He felt a nervous jolt in his chest as he stood before his stern superior, realizing that their intense connection from the night before had been completely erased from her mind. He accepted her professional greeting with a polite nod, struggling with the realization that their entire relationship history had been reset to zero. After a quick meeting with the friendly manager Minu and the welcoming department head Sangdo, Sarah handed Inchul a thick training manual and told him to study it thoroughly. Settling into his desk, Inchul tried to focus on the screen, but the rhythmic clicking of his mouse only seemed to highlight his wandering thoughts. He found it incredibly difficult to concentrate on corporate policies when his mind kept drifting back to the sussy cardio moments he had shared with Sue just one night ago. He began to feel like a complete degenerate for having such vivid memories while sitting so close to the innocent and helpful Sarah. He wrestled with his conscience, wondering if he was becoming a bad person for even considering a repeat of the past, while his original mission was to win Sarah's heart. His internal debate was interrupted when Sue suddenly loomed over his shoulder, asking if he was having any trouble with his work. She reminded him that reading the manual was the only way to make up for his poor start that morning, and told him to get his act together with a look that was both intimidating and strangely captivating. Inchul could only watch in a daze as she walked away, finding himself even more conflicted about which woman he should be focusing on. Later that evening, the team gathered at a local restaurant for a welcome dinner, and Inchul decided to use his future knowledge to his advantage once again. He served a specific cut of pork cheek to the department head, who was delighted that a new hire already knew his favorite signature dish. As the drinks began to flow and the atmosphere warmed up, Inchul reflected on his previous success at this same event. He realized that if he followed the same pattern as before, he might actually get another chance to be alone with Sue. Despite his feelings for Sarah, he couldn't help the way his heart raced at the thought of a second chance with his tough superior. Inchul decided to lean into his previous experience during the welcome dinner by expertly pouring Sue a glass of soju. He didn't even mention the beer, knowing her preferences better than any rookie hire should, and he watched with a bit of pride as she reacted with surprise to his attentiveness. He reflected on his strange situation, acknowledging that while his heart was firmly set on Sarah, his recent history with Sue was creating a significant amount of mental static. He realized that, while his long-term goal was love, the immediate allure of a repeating connection was proving nearly impossible to resist. He felt like a bit of a scoundrel for being so easily swayed by the familiarity of the previous night, but he ultimately decided that he might as well see where this repeating cycle would lead him. By the time 4 hours had passed, the office party had wound down, and the two of them found themselves standing alone in the cool night air. Sue noted that they hadn't actually had a chance to talk properly and suggested they head out for another round. Inchul didn't hesitate for a single second, offering an enthusiastic agreement that signaled the start of a very familiar chain of events. He felt like a passenger on a high-speed train that was racing toward a predictable destination, and he realized that some parts of history were destined to repeat themselves no matter how many times the clock was reset. Soon enough, the professional boundaries of the office were a distant memory as they found themselves in a much more sussy setting. Sue teased him about being a bad guy for making her act so out of character and noted how strange it was that she felt so drawn to him. Inchul countered that she was actually the one responsible for the current state, finding a bit of humor in the fact that they were having the exact same playful argument as the last time. He accepted his role in the chaos of the night. Inchul woke up with the phantom sounds of a frantic encounter still ringing in his ears. His memory of the night before was a blurry marathon of cardio energy, where he had ignored every plea to rest, insisting that the night was far too short to waste on sleep. As the new day dawned, he found himself standing before the company building once again, looking much more exhausted than a rookie on his second day should ever be. He stepped out of the elevator and immediately spotted Sue standing in the hallway, looking remarkably professional despite the cardio moments they shared. Inchul tried to offer a casual greeting, but he was met with a cold and piercing glare that could freeze time itself. Sue made it very clear that they were currently in a place of business and that he needed to remember the proper way to address a superior. Inchul quickly realized that his attempt to be overly familiar was a massive mistake and decided that he needed to be much more cautious if he wanted to survive the day. He bowed respectfully and retreated into the office, telling himself that he couldn't afford to overdo things this time around. As he settled into his desk, he noticed that the office atmosphere was as busy as ever, with his colleagues already lost in the rhythmic clicking of their keyboards. His attention soon drifted to Sarah, who was looking as graceful as ever while she managed a mountain of paperwork. Inchul knew that the coming hours were critical, and he watched her closely as she prepared to submit an important report. He remembered the specific details of this day from his previous life and waited for the perfect moment to intervene. When Sarah stood up to deliver her folder, the universe cooperated by causing her to drop a stack of papers right in front of his desk. Inchul didn't hesitate to help, kneeling down to gather the scattered documents while his future knowledge kicked into high gear. He noted that the report was missing the essential statistics from the previous year and suggested that adding them would make her current data look much more impressive to the team leader. Sarah looked at him with a mix of surprise and genuine realization, clearly impressed that a new hire could spot such a professional detail so quickly. Inchul felt a massive surge of confidence as he handed the papers back, realizing that he had successfully managed to look cool and capable instead of acting like a complete dork. He offered a bright smile and a helpful comment, feeling that his standing in her eyes was finally starting to improve. The payoff for his expertise arrived later that afternoon when Sarah approached him with a fresh vanilla latte. She was laughing and clearly grateful for the advice that had made her meeting go so smoothly. Inchul savored the moment, feeling like he was finally winning the battle for her heart as they shared a lighthearted conversation. He even managed to offer a playful wink, convinced that he was finally playing his cards right. However, his sense of victory was cut short when he noticed a very familiar and very angry figure watching them from the background. Sue was staring at their friendly exchange with a look of pure jealousy that sent a chill down his spine. Inchul realized that while he was making progress with Sarah, he was inadvertently fueling a fire in his stern superior that was bound to explode. He started to sweat as he imagined the storage room incident repeating itself, knowing that his sussy history with Sue was a ticking time bomb. He decided that the best course of action was to finish his work and disappear before the office politics turned into a literal battleground. When the department head finally waved his hand and told everyone to head home for the evening, Inchul felt a level of relief that was hard to describe. He watched the cheerful manager say his goodbyes and congratulated himself on surviving another day without a total catastrophe. He had successfully shown Sarah his professional side and received a sweet reward for his efforts, all while avoiding another disastrous encounter in the storage room. Inchul felt his heart hammering against his ribs as a sudden voice called out his name, breaking his concentration and making him jump in his seat. He turned around slowly to find Sue standing right behind him with a request for a bit of help. She explained that she was buried under a mountain of tasks and needed his assistance for a moment. Inchul felt a wave of dread wash over him as he realized that the day was following a very familiar and dangerous pattern. He could only offer a weak and nervous response as she led him toward a corner of the office that was filled with messy bookshelves and scattered documents. Sue told him to wait there and start cleaning up the chaos while she finished her own work. Inchul hesitated, wondering if the cleanup really needed to happen at that exact moment. This only made Sue cross her arms and point out that he was already trying to dodge his duties despite being a new employee. Inchul tried to explain that it wasn't laziness, but a genuine fear that things were about to spiral out of control again. He realized that, if they stayed in this secluded spot, the same disaster from his previous memory was almost guaranteed to happen. Driven by pure panic and a desire to change the outcome, he decided he had to take control of the situation before it was too late. His heart continued to race as he lunged forward and slammed his hand against the wall right next to her head, trapping her in place with a sudden burst of energy. In a desperate and misguided attempt to sound assertive, he suggested that it would be much better if the two of them just focused on having a good time together instead of working. As soon as the words left his mouth, he felt like an absolute idiot and wondered why he was saying such nonsense. Sue stared back at him with wide eyes, her face turning a bright shade of red as she wondered what kind of activity he was actually suggesting. Inchul felt his own face burning with intense embarrassment. Inchul followed up his awkward performance by suddenly declaring that he really wanted to eat some ramen, prepared specifically by her. He tried to justify this random request by pointing out that she had left the party early the night before and likely hadn't had a chance to properly recover from her hangover. As he spoke, he internally worried that he was being far too bold and realized he had no idea if he was overdoing it again. Much to his surprise, Sue considered the idea and eventually asked if he simply wanted to come over to her place right then. Inchul was stunned by the sudden turn of events, but quickly agreed as they prepared to leave the building together. They walked through the cool night air with Inchul dutifully carrying a bag filled with drinks for the evening. From a distance, assistant manager Sarah watched them get into a taxi and felt a strange sense of relief. She assumed that Sue was simply taking care of the new hire and found the two of them to be quite a charming pair. Once they arrived at the apartment, Inchul was immediately impressed by how tidy and wonderful the place smelled. He found himself feeling incredibly emotional and overwhelmed by the fact that he was actually inside a woman's private home for the first time. Sue felt a bit self-conscious as she sat on the floor, mentioning that she would have cleaned up more if she had known she would have a guest. She told him to have a seat, and Inchul struggled to keep his composure while settling in next to her. The atmosphere became incredibly heavy as they sat in a silence so thick it could be cut with a knife. Both of them wondered what they were supposed to do next. Sue began to feel like a total idiot for bringing her subordinate home, worrying that any professional mood they had was completely gone. To fix the awkward tension, she suggested they find something to watch on the streaming service. They eventually picked out a soft, mellow movie called Nana Land. Inchul felt like he was finally living out one of his most cherished dreams. As they settled in to watch the film together, Sue quickly realized that the movie was not exactly her cup of tea and found herself reaching for her drink while thinking about how incredibly dull the plot had become. She decided to speak up about how boring the story was, but was immediately silenced when she glanced over at her guest and saw the state he was in. Inchul was not just watching the movie, but was currently experiencing a complete emotional breakdown as tears began to pour down his face in a never-ending stream. Sue was absolutely stunned by this display of sensitivity and wondered if he was actually having a crisis over such a common and predictable storyline. He managed to explain through his weeping that the idea of two people loving each other but being unable to meet was simply too tragic for his heart to bear. He spoke about how painful that kind of love must be and wondered how anyone could survive such a heavy burden. Sue watched him with a mix of confusion and genuine curiosity because she truly could not figure out which version of this man was the real one. As the room fell quiet again, Sue found her thoughts drifting back to the events of the previous night and suddenly felt a wave of energy wash over her entire body. She became painfully conscious of his presence, sitting close to her, and started fanning herself in a desperate attempt to cool down. Inchul noticed her sudden change in behavior and immediately worried that she might be coming down with a sickness. He reached out with total sincerity and placed his hand against her forehead to check for a fever, but was surprised to find that her temperature seemed perfectly normal. Sue looked at him with an expression of total disbelief and told him he was a complete idiot for being so oblivious to what was actually happening in the room. Her initial frustration quickly shifted into a much more focused gaze as she realized that his accidental act was having a profound effect on her. She decided to stop hiding her feelings and leaned in to start a cardio session. While assistant manager Yeju sat alone at a dimly lit bar, her expression was a perfect picture of absolute boredom as she swirled her drink. She found the atmosphere and the music completely uninspired, feeling that the entire night was a bit of a letdown. Her solitude was soon interrupted by a man who thought he was being incredibly smooth, approaching her with a wink and asking if she was there all by herself. He confidently suggested that they should have a drink together, assuming that he could easily solve her boredom with a little bit of charm and alcohol. He internally congratulated himself, thinking that all women were essentially the same and just needed to be warmed up before being overwhelmed by his supposed charisma. He kept the drinks flowing, but he quickly realized he had made a massive tactical error when Yeju began downing strong shots at a speed that defied logic. He was left staring in total shock as she casually called for another round, making him wonder how someone could possibly drink that much, that fast, without even blinking. He tried to keep up his confident facade, but it was clear that he had walked into a competition he was destined to lose. Fortunately for Inchul, his own night was heading in a much more pleasant direction as he realized he had finally broken the cycle of returning to the past. He found himself walking through the city streets with Suai, who was in high spirits as she led him toward a new yakitori place she had found on social media. She was incredibly excited about the reservation she had made, and Inchul felt a sense of genuine happiness as they enjoyed some delicious food right after finishing their shift. He reflected on how much better life was when he wasn't constantly worrying about time rewinding on him. Back at the office the following day, Inchul watched Sarah from his desk and felt a surge of optimism about his future. He told himself that he was finally getting to know her better, and that if he could just maintain this professional pace, he might actually have a chance to win her heart. He felt determined to keep his focus and see where this new journey would lead him, convinced that everything was finally falling into place. However, the professional stability he was counting on was shattered during a meeting in the conference room. The team leader stood before them and delivered a sudden announcement that Inchul would be heading to the East Coast for a business trip. He wouldn't be going alone, as he was assigned to travel with manager Minu and the blunt assistant manager Yiju. About 30 minutes before the big announcement, the office was locked in a standard meeting with manager Minu analyzing travel trends for the quarter. While everyone else was focused on the charts and statistics, Inchul was busy drifting off into a very vivid daydream about the previous cardio night. He could not stop replaying the intense and high-energy sussy moments he had shared with Sue, and the memories were making him look quite foolish as he sat there with a dazed, blissful smile on his face. He was so lost in his own little world that he even started wondering if he might get another private cardio invitation to her house later that evening. Even when Sarah leaned over to whisper a helpful warning for him to focus, because the chief might ask him for a briefing, he just felt like he had finally reached a state of absolute heaven. However, his blissful state did not last very long, because Sue was watching his every move with growing irritation. She could tell exactly what was going through his head and decided that a rookie hire should not be so distracted during a professional meeting. To snap him back to reality, she reached under the table and delivered a sudden, sharp reminder that left Inchul gasping in a mix of surprise and genuine agony. He felt like a literal bolt of lightning had just struck his system, and the sudden commotion immediately drew the attention of the stern section chief. The leader noticed his frantic expression and demanded to know why he was so distracted and if the current topic was something he felt he did not need to focus on. Inchul felt his heart drop as Sue watched him with a hidden, sussy glint in her eyes, leaving him to scramble for a way to save his dignity. He quickly claimed that he was simply taking a moment to organize his thoughts into a brilliant new strategy. He managed to pivot perfectly, suggesting they use the current data to target the younger generation by focusing on the East Coast and its trending drama locations. To his absolute surprise, even the blunt Yiju and the meticulous section chief were actually impressed by such a creative and well-timed idea coming from a newcomer. Once the meeting concluded and the details for the East Coast trip were finalized, Inchul pulled Sue aside into the quiet stairwell to express his absolute shock at her behavior. He was deeply worried that someone might have noticed her sudden attack under the table and wondered why she was being so aggressive in a professional setting. Sue was still fuming, telling him that a man who was so concerned about other people seeing should not have been acting like such a total dork in front of the entire team. Inchul was left standing there in total confusion, trying to figure out exactly what he had done wrong to deserve such a fierce and blushing lecture. She wasted no time in pointing out that he had been smiling from ear to ear while looking at the other woman and demanded an explanation for his behavior. Her cheeks were flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment as she tried to argue that, even though there was nothing official between them, his actions were still incredibly bothersome. Inchul stood there in a cold sweat, struggling to find the right words, while secretly realizing that his tough superior was actually quite adorable when she was being so transparently jealous. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, a sudden and terrifying memory of the storage room disaster flashed through his mind like a warning from a past life. He remembered the look of pure horror on Sarah's face and the absolute chaos of being caught in such a compromising situation, and he realized he had to change the subject immediately before history decided to repeat itself in the worst way possible. Driven by a desperate need for survival, he grabbed Sue and pinned her against the wall with a sudden burst of confidence that he didn't even know he possessed. He looked her directly in the eyes and claimed that she was completely misunderstanding the situation because he was only paying attention to the chief's perfume. He managed to spin a convincing story about how the scent was so lovely that he had been thinking about buying a bottle as a gift for Sue instead. The logic was a bit thin, but it was enough to catch her off guard as she stared at him with a look of pure confusion. Inchul felt a surge of pride as he realized his quick thinking had successfully reversed the momentum of the conversation and left her completely speechless. Without giving her a chance to recover her usual professional armor, he leaned in and silenced her with a sudden and very bold sussy gesture right there in the stairwell. Sui eventually pushed him away with a frantic reminder that they were still technically inside the company building and that his behavior was bordering on reckless. She turned her attention to her compact mirror, grumbling about how he had made her appearance a total mess. Inchul could only offer a shy and happy laugh while scratching his head, admitting that he simply couldn't help himself because he liked her so much. She told him to stop talking nonsense and commanded him to follow her, though the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a much softer glow. As the two of them made their exit down the stairs, they were completely unaware of the audience they had attracted. Assistant manager Yiju stood just a few steps above them, casually puffing on her electronic cigarette while watching the entire drama unfold. She blew out a slow cloud of smoke and watched them disappear, finding the secret office activity to be a rather cute addition to her otherwise boring evening. The exploration day finally arrived as the team piled into a white SUV to begin their journey toward the coast. Manager Minu took the wheel with Inchul riding shotgun, while assistant manager Yiju settled into the back seat in her comfortable athletic gear. As the green scenery blurred past the windows, Inchul found himself lost in a very surprising memory from the previous weekend. He had been planning a quiet night of video games since Sue had her own plans, but his walk home took an unexpected turn when he spotted a familiar pair through a cafe window. He had been absolutely stunned to see Minu and Yiju meeting up privately outside of work hours, which was a development he had never even considered possible. The memory felt even more intense because of the terrifying look Minu had given him when they accidentally locked eyes through the glass. The manager had made a very clear and silent gesture suggesting that Inchul should keep his mouth shut if he valued his life. Back in the present, Inchul felt a cold shiver as he realized he was currently trapped in a moving vehicle with the very man who had threatened him. He tried to distract himself by admiring the beautiful view of the sea as they cruised along the coastal road, but his curiosity eventually got the better of him. He couldn't help but peek toward the back seat where Yiju had fallen into a deep and heavy sleep. She looked much less intimidating while napping, but her incredibly relaxed posture made Inchul feel very flustered, and he quickly snapped his head back toward the windshield. Minu noticed the rookie's wandering eyes and offered a friendly but firm suggestion that it would be much wiser for him to keep his gaze focused strictly on the road ahead. Inchul apologized with a nervous laugh and decided to pivot the conversation by asking how such an unlikely couple had actually started their relationship. Minu admitted with a proud smile that he had been the one to make the first move and was pleasantly surprised when she told him to just act naturally around her. Inchul looked at his superior and felt a strange mix of confusion and realization as he wondered if Yiju's standards were actually much lower than her blunt personality led people to believe. He began to realize that the office hierarchy was far more complicated than he ever imagined during his previous life, and that almost everyone was hiding a secret of their own. Minu continued to outline their professional schedule for the day, which involved meeting with local business partners before finally heading to their lodge for the night. Just as Inchul was trying to settle into the work-related rhythm of the trip, his phone lit up in the center console with a sudden notification. He saw a private message from Sui, demanding that he call her the moment he arrived at his destination. 2 hours later, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the palm trees as the team finally neared their destination. Inside the car, manager Minu let out a heavy sigh about the irony of modern life, noting how they often spend hours talking on the phone only to have everything settled in a fraction of that time whenever they actually meet in person. Inchul offered a cheerful laugh as he looked at the tablets and documents scattered around them, feeling the excitement of the trip finally kicking in. He was curious about their accommodations and wondered if they would be staying at a simple bed and breakfast for the night. Minu offered a knowing smile and suggested that a basic rental would be a complete waste of effort after such a long journey to the coast. The white SUV soon pulled up to a stunning luxury villa, complete with a sparkling pool and elegant wooden decking that looked like something out of a high-end travel magazine. Inchul was absolutely floored by the sight and assumed that the company must have a massive budget to afford such a magnificent place for a simple business trip. Minu looked a bit bashful as he clarified that the villa was actually paid for with his own personal savings rather than the company credit card. Yiju seemed genuinely impressed as she looked around the stylish interior, mentioning that the place was truly beautiful and surpassed her expectations. After they dropped their luggage in the entryway, she admitted that the long day of travel had left her feeling a bit sticky and decided she needed to wash up immediately. While she headed off to find the shower, Minu took charge of the evening plans and told Inchul that it was time to get everything ready for a big celebration. He started setting up the outdoor grill with practiced ease and instructed the rookie to head out to the local market to buy plenty of pork, neck, and alcohol. As Inchul walked through the quiet grounds of the villa, he felt a growing sense of dread about the specific shopping list he had been given. He remembered, from his previous life, that manager Minu had a notoriously low tolerance for alcohol, and always ended up becoming a massive responsibility whenever he had too much to drink. He paused in his tracks as a very complicated realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. While the sound of the shower echoed back at the villa and Yiju enjoyed the water to refresh herself after the tiring day, Inchul's mind began to race through the potential outcomes of the night. He realized that if history repeated itself and the manager passed out early from the drinks, he would find himself in the very awkward and unpredictable position of being left completely alone with the blunt and intimidating assistant manager Yiju. Inchul took over the grilling duties with a bright smile and called his superiors down to enjoy the feast he had prepared under the warm evening lights. Minu and Yiju arrived looking much more relaxed in their casual evening wear and offered the rookie some well-earned praise for his hard work at the grill. However, Inchul was secretly carrying a heavy burden of knowledge thanks to a private conversation he had shared with Minu just half an hour earlier. The manager had pulled him aside to suggest that Inchul should only have a few drinks before finding a polite excuse to disappear and leave the two of them alone for the rest of the night. Inchul had agreed with a nervous laugh, though he could not help but feel like a strategic piece in a very awkward puzzle. To kick off the festivities, Minu proudly revealed a premium bottle of 30-year-old whiskey and even brought out plenty of ice to make the experience truly special. Inchul watched with growing concern as the manager poured the potent liquid because he knew all too well that his superior's ambition far exceeded his actual physical tolerance for high-end spirits. They raised their glasses to a successful exploration and began their celebration in high spirits, with Inchul wondering how long the manager would actually last. True to his past experiences, Inchul watched as the clock struck 1 hour later and found manager Minu completely defeated by the alcohol and snoring loudly with his face pressed against the table. While the manager was out for the count, Yiju remained perfectly composed and continued to pour herself shots of the strong whiskey as if it were nothing more than plain water. She noted that Inchul was surprisingly good at handling his drinks, which made the rookie realize he was reaching his own limit and needed to stay sharp. Just as the atmosphere between them was becoming dangerously quiet, Inchul's phone began to vibrate with an urgent call from the one person he was most afraid of at that moment. Seeing the name of his office superior on the screen sent a jolt of panic through his system, and he struggled to keep a straight face. Yiju casually told him that he could just take the call right there at the table, but Inchul insisted on heading out to the pool deck for some fresh air while making a frantic excuse about the signal. Once he was safely outside, he was met with a verbal explosion as Sue demanded to know if he had a death wish for ignoring her messages for so many hours. She was sitting at home painting her toenails and fuming over the fact that he had not contacted her since the moment he arrived at the coast. Inchul tried to explain that he had simply been overwhelmed by the busy schedule of the trip, but his heart nearly stopped when he realized he was no longer alone on the deck. Yiju had followed him outside and stood there casually puffing on her electronic cigarette, while guessing that the person on the other end of the line was definitely Suai. She watched his panicked expression and noted that his reaction was all the proof she needed to confirm her suspicions about their sussy connection. Inchul stood frozen in total shock as she pointed out that the two of them had been quite the spectacle at the office a few days ago. Inchul was suddenly faced with the terrifying reality that his sussy office life had been compromised because Yiju had seen everything that went down in the stairwell back at the company. He realized with a sinking feeling that his entire career was now on the line, and he was convinced that he would be fired if word of his relationship reached the department head. In a desperate attempt to gain some leverage, he pointed out that he wasn't the only one with secrets and reminded Yiju that he had seen her out with manager Minu. He claimed he wouldn't stay silent if she decided to talk, but Yiju wasn't intimidated at all, as she casually explained that having a cup of coffee at a cafe was hardly a scandal. She then leaned in with a sussy glint in her eye and noted that what she saw in the office involved much more intense and embarrassing behavior that was far harder to explain away. The realization that he had no cards left to play hit Inchul like a physical blow, and he immediately abandoned his attempt at being tough. He dropped to his knees in a full bow to beg for mercy and pleaded for her to forgive him just this once, while promising to do absolutely anything. She asked if she would only keep his secret safe. He reflected on how he had traveled through time, specifically to fix his life, and he was determined to do whatever it took to make sure his past mistakes didn't ruin his future. Yiju watched him with a look of pure amusement and decided to see just how serious he was about his promise to be obedient. She told him that if he really wanted her silence, he would have to start by barking like a loyal dog right then and there. Inchul looked up at her in total disbelief, wondering if he was dealing with someone who was genuinely losing their mind. But he eventually decided that his pride was a small price to pay for: survival. He shut his eyes tight and began making the most convincing barking and growling sounds he could muster while crouching on the deck. The sight of her junior colleague acting like a pet was more than Yiju could have hoped for, and she was genuinely surprised that he was actually following her ridiculous command. She watched him with a wide grin and a racing heart, realizing that she had found a completely new and unexpected source of entertainment. The quiet night air was suddenly shattered when manager Minu stumbled onto the deck, loudly calling for Yiju and wondering where everyone had disappeared to. The high-energy dog performance was cut short as Yiju and Inchul scrambled to look normal in a state of blind panic. Inchul managed to vanish into a hiding spot just as the manager arrived, looking quite flushed and disheveled from his heavy drinking session. Minu spotted Yiju and noted that she was still awake, while Yiju played it perfectly cool by claiming she had only stepped outside to get a bit of fresh air. The manager was so focused on his own hangover that he didn't suspect a thing, simply assuming the cool breeze was a good idea after their intense night with the whiskey bottle. He eventually looked around and realized the new hire was nowhere to be found, asking Yiju if she knew where Inchul had gone. She looked down at the spot where the rookie was currently crouched in a state of absolute terror and casually suggested that he was probably alright somewhere nearby. She eventually led the unsuspecting manager back inside, leaving Inchul to wonder how he was going to survive the rest of the trip without getting caught or losing his mind. By the next morning, the luxury villa was filled with the savory aroma of breakfast as a very attentive Minu prepared traditional hangover soup for the team. He was particularly focused on Yiju and served her with a level of doting care that made Inchul feel like a very awkward third wheel at the table. Yiju played her part with remarkable skill, letting out a weary sigh and mentioning that she had somehow overexerted herself the night before. She claimed that her physical condition was feeling quite bad and suggested that it might be best if she skipped the day's planned coastal exploration to rest. Inchul sat there quietly, sipping his soup and internally grumbling about her acting skills, knowing full well that she was the one who seemed to have the most energy during their sussy encounter on the deck. Manager Manu was deeply moved by her supposed illness and immediately began to worry about her well-being. He initially suggested that a change of pace by the sea might make her feel better, but Yiju insisted that her body was only getting worse as time went on. Driven by a sense of protective leadership, Minu came to a sudden and very unfortunate conclusion for the poor rookie. He decided that it would be far too dangerous to leave Yiju alone in the villa while she was feeling so unwell, and commanded Inchul to stay behind and take care of her. The manager was quite proud of his decision, thinking he was being a thoughtful partner and a responsible boss at the same time. Inchul sat in a frozen state of absolute horror, realizing that this was a nightmare scenario where he was being left entirely at the mercy of the woman who had just made him bark like a pet. As Minu waved a happy goodbye and headed out for a safe trip, Inchul could only offer a weak and trembling smile. As soon as manager Minu's car disappeared into a cloud of dust, the atmosphere at the villa shifted instantly from a quiet sick ward to a high-stakes survival game. Inchul stood there, feeling completely defeated, while Yiju let out a long sigh of relief, as if she had just finished a world-class performance. She noted that Minu was as predictable as ever, and never failed to meet her expectations, which gave her the perfect opening to focus her attention back on the rookie hire. She suggested with a playful look that they should finally finish what they started the day before, and Inchul felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized his nightmare was just beginning. He desperately tried to point out that she had claimed to be feeling unwell just moments ago, but she simply brushed it off by saying she had made a miraculous recovery. When he suggested that she should probably get to work if she was feeling so healthy, she informed him that she certainly would once she finished dealing with him first. She admitted that her excitement from the previous night had kept her from getting even a single wink of sleep, and she decided that it was finally time to give Inchul a very special reward. The intense look in her eyes was enough to make him feel like a rabbit staring into the gaze of a very hungry predator, and he realized that his only choice was to try and match her unpredictable pace. While the chaos was unfolding at the villa, the scene shifted back to the city, where a very annoyed Suai was pacing around her apartment. She was fuming over the fact that Inchul had not contacted her once since he arrived at the coast, and she was ready to deliver a legendary lecture the moment he picked up his phone. Her frustration turned into a sudden burst of excitement when her phone finally lit up with a call from the man she had labeled as an idiot in her contacts. She stepped out into the hallway and answered with a sharp demand to know why he had hung up on her the day before, but she was immediately taken aback by the sound of his voice. Back on the coast, Inchul was currently experiencing a level of cardio practice that he never could have prepared for during his first life. He was lying flat on his back while Yiju was assisting. He struggled to maintain his composure and begged Sue to stay on the line for just 5 minutes as a way to distract himself from the intense cardio feelings. Sue was understandably confused and asked if he was actually hurt somewhere, because his voice was shaking so much, it sounded like he was in genuine pain. Inchul had to think fast and came up with the ridiculous excuse that he had simply tripped on a very sharp rock while exploring the mountains. A few hours later, the quiet night air at the villa was filled only by the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard as assistant manager Yiju focused on her laptop while Inchul sat across from her, looking like a man who had survived a major natural disaster. He struggled to focus on his notes, his mind swirling with the realization that Yiju was shamelessly toying with him now that she held his biggest secret in her hands. He watched her secretly from across the table, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief at how easily she had taken control of the situation and forced him into such a submissive role. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like a helpless pawn in her elaborate game, and he internally vowed that he would not let things continue this way forever. He imagined a future where the roles were reversed, and he could finally be the one in charge, leading an intense cardio session of his own, where he would not allow her a single moment to rest. His thoughts drifted back to the high-energy workout they had just finished, remembering how the sheer intensity of the encounter had left him completely breathless and overwhelmed. Just as he was drowning in his own dramatic internal monologue, the door opened and manager Manu finally returned, waving a cheerful greeting and asking if the two of them had managed to get any work done during his absence. Inchul offered a nervous and shaky response, trying his best to look like a diligent employee, while the manager approached Iju with a look of genuine concern. Minu reached out to check her forehead, worried that she still had a fever and was pushing herself too hard for the sake of the company. Iju met his gaze with a calm and mysterious smile, gently holding his hand and claiming that she felt much better now because Inchul had taken such thorough and heartfelt care of her during the day. The manager was absolutely delighted by this report and offered a proud pat on Inchul's shoulder, loudly declaring that the new hire was truly a trustworthy and reliable colleague. He had no idea about the hidden meaning behind her words and happily suggested that they should all pack up their things and head back to the city immediately. As they walked toward the car, Inchul felt a familiar vibration in his pocket and pulled out his phone to see a series of urgent messages from Sue. She was demanding to know his arrival time and if he planned on stopping by the office that evening, which made him realize that his complicated double life was about to become even more stressful. He calculated that they would arrive back in town around 10 o'clock and wondered what kind of lecture was waiting for him once he faced his other superior. Not long after, they arrived at a street corner near his apartment where Manu stopped the car to let him out, offering a friendly wave and promising to see him the following week. Inchul stood on the sidewalk and watched as Yiju offered him a playful and sussy wink from the back seat, leaving the manager to wonder if she had something final to say to the rookie. She simply hummed a little tune and mentioned that she would save her comments for their next meeting, leaving Inchul standing alone in the cool night air. He let out a heavy and weary sigh as the car drove away, feeling a level of exhaustion that surpassed anything he had ever experienced in his first life. Inchul gripped his backpack strap tightly, deciding that for the moment, all he wanted was to escape into the simple comfort of his mobile games before falling into a deep sleep. As he walked down the stairs toward the station, he felt the heavy weight of the day pressing down on him, only to be jolted back to reality by a sudden voice calling out his name. He turned around with a look of pure confusion, nearly jumping out of his skin when he saw Sue standing right there in the middle of the night. She offered a cheerful greeting and asked if he had only just arrived back in the city. Inchul felt a nervous blush creeping up his neck as he struggled to understand why on earth his superior would be hanging around this area at such an hour. He suddenly realized that she might have actually been waiting for him after seeing his earlier messages, a thought that made his heart skip a beat and his face turn red. Sue immediately became flustered and playfully swatted him away, calling him an absolute idiot for thinking she would ever do something so sentimental. She quickly made up an excuse, claiming she merely had an appointment in the neighborhood and happened to spot him by pure coincidence while she was heading back. Inchul looked at her with a highly skeptical expression, but her attention shifted to how ragged he appeared. She noted that he looked quite unwell and wondered if the coastal business trip had been a total nightmare for his energy levels. They began walking down the stairs together as Inchul admitted that he was currently hanging on by a thread and felt like he might actually collapse if he did not get some rest immediately. He told her his only plan was to crawl into his own bed and stay there for the foreseeable future because he was truly at his limit. Sue went silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on him with a mysterious and focused intensity before she let out a determined sigh. Before he could even process what was happening, she reached out and grabbed him with a firm grip, commanding him to follow her without any further complaints. Inchul stumbled along behind her in total shock, trying to explain that he was far too exhausted for any more office drama or late-night outings, but she simply looked back with a sussy smile and told him to be quiet and stay close. He soon found himself standing in a quiet hallway outside a door, his mind racing as he wondered what exactly she was trying to do. The door slowly creaked open, and Sue called his name with a soft but confident tone that made his heart race. When Inchul turned around to face her, his eyes nearly popped out of his head and his face turned a deep shade of crimson. He was completely speechless and gripped by a sudden surge of panic at the sight of her choice of sussy clothing. The next day arrived with a frantic energy as Inchul found himself sprinting through the city streets in a desperate race against the clock. He was late for work yet again and felt like his lungs might actually burst as he cursed his own habit of oversleeping. He deeply regretted not listening to Sue the night before, when she told him to get some rest, realizing that his exhaustion had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. As he dashed toward the office, his mind raced with terrifying visions of the team leader, screaming at him and demanding to know if he thought his career was some kind of elaborate joke. He finally reached the office building and began a high-stakes, stealth mission, creeping through the glass doors and hoping to reach his desk before anyone noticed his arrival. He let out a small sigh of relief when he saw that Sarah was not currently at her station, giving him a narrow window of opportunity to slip into his chair and pretend he had been there all along. However, his hopes for a clean escape were shattered when he bumped directly into manager Manu, who was looking remarkably stern and professional in a sharp gray shirt and tie. Inchul offered a nervous and shaky apology, but his heart dropped when the manager asked him what exactly he thought he was doing and what time he believed it to be. The atmosphere grew incredibly tense as Minu pointed out that while he understood the business trip was exhausting, punctuality was a basic expectation that could not be ignored. He commanded the rookie to be much more careful from now on, leaving Inchul standing there in a state of total confusion because the manager was usually such a relaxed and friendly person. As Minu walked away, Inchul couldn't help but feel that something was fundamentally wrong with the office dynamic, wondering if the events of the coastal trip had changed his superior's opinion of him forever. He began the long walk toward his desk, but his internal panic reached a new peak when he spotted assistant manager Yiju watching him with a playful and knowing expression. A sudden and terrifying realization flashed through his mind as he remembered the sussy power dynamic they had established at the villa, and he felt a cold sweat breaking out at the thought of what she might do to him next. His fears were confirmed when she called him over to show him a picture of her dog on her phone, casually noting how cute the little animal was while Sarah leaned in to offer her own enthusiastic compliments. Sarah admitted that she had always wanted a dog of her own since she was a child, but Yiju countered by saying that raising a pet wasn't always a pleasant experience. She looked directly at Inchul with a sussy glint in her eyes and explained that her dog would often go completely crazy and try to lick her all the time, making it quite a handful to manage. Inchul realized that she was shamelessly using the story as a way to make fun of him in front of their colleagues, and he felt a surge of silent fury as he vowed to find a way to get his revenge for her teasing. Determined to prove his worth and stay out of further trouble, Inchul finally settled into his seat and focused all of his energy on his computer screen. He threw himself into his tasks with an intensity that made his fingers fly across the keyboard, deciding that his only path to survival was to become the most diligent employee in the building. From across the room, Sue watched him work while clutching a warm drink, thinking to herself that he was a complete idiot for not sleeping when she told him to. Despite her stern thoughts, she felt a lingering sense of concern for him and decided that she would have to buy him a refreshing drink later to help him get through the day. As the sun began to set and the long workday finally reached its conclusion, the staff began to pack their bags and offer cheerful goodbyes to one another. Inchul felt a massive wave of relief wash over him as he pulled on his jacket, convinced that he had managed to survive the day without any major disasters or public humiliations. He offered a shy and happy smile to himself, grateful that the manager hadn't said anything else and that he was finally free to go home and collapse. Just as he was about to make his exit, a sudden and authoritative voice called out his name, stopping him dead in his tracks. He turned around to see manager Manu standing there with his hands on his hips and a very serious expression, stating in a firm tone that the two of them needed to have a private talk immediately. Manu led Inchul to a quiet area away from the main office floor, looking as serious as a man about to deliver a life-changing lecture. Inchul followed with a heavy heart, convinced that his cardio activities on the coast had finally been exposed and that his career was about to end in a cloud of cigarette smoke. He watched Manu light a cigarette with a steady hand and felt his own heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Before the manager could even utter a single word, Inchul's nerves finally snapped. He dropped into a deep bow and began shouting apologies at the floor, claiming that whatever had happened during the trip was completely unintentional and simply a freak accident of timing. He begged for forgiveness while his mind raced through all the ways his life was about to fall apart. However, Minu just stared at him with total confusion and wondered what on earth the rookie hire was actually talking about. He let out a slow puff of smoke and told Inchul not to take his earlier behavior to heart. He explained that he had only acted so coldly in the morning because the strict team leader was watching their every move. He noted that if she had been the one to catch Inchul being late instead of him, the consequences would have been far more lethal for a rookie's career. Inchul felt a massive wave of relief wash over him and realized that his manager was actually a guardian angel in a gray dress shirt. His gratitude only grew when Minu reached into his pocket and produced a shiny corporate credit card with a proud grin. He explained that the department head had rewarded their hard work on the trip with a generous budget for a night out. Inchul was suddenly filled with excitement and wondered what kind of delicious feast was in his immediate future. His joy was short-lived, however, because the rhythmic clicking of high heels announced the arrival of assistant manager Yiju. She walked up to the pair and asked if their private conversation was finally over, looking remarkably composed in her white top and short skirt. Inchul froze in his tracks as she offered a mysterious smile and tossed her hair back with an air of total confidence. As they prepared to head out, Yiju leaned in and whispered directly into Inchul's ear, informing him that their little game was only just beginning. She called him a bastard with a playful but chilling intensity before walking away with a little tune on her lips. Inchul stood there in a daze, trapped between a nervous laugh and a genuine desire to flee for his life. 3 hours later, the group was walking through the night streets after a lavish meal filled with expensive red wine. Inchul noted that his company had a very strange way of operating, especially considering they were drinking such high-end bottles just for a simple team meetup. He offered a bright smile and thanked the manager for the wonderful evening, hoping this was finally the moment where he could escape to the safety of his own bed. His plans for freedom were crushed instantly when Minu's heavy hand landed firmly on his shoulder. The manager declared that the night was still young and that the second round of festivities would be taking place at his own home. Inchul watched with a sinking feeling as manager Minu enthusiastically led the way to his apartment, promising the group that his personal collection of alcohol was something truly special to look forward to. The rookie felt like he was walking toward his own doom and internally shouted that this situation simply could not be happening to him. They eventually arrived at a large apartment complex where the manager punched in his security code with a cheerful energy that stood in sharp contrast to Inchul's mounting anxiety. Minu swung the door open and invited them inside, leaving Inchul and Yiju to step into the private sanctuary of their boss. As he walked through the entryway, Inchul was momentarily stunned by the sleek and modern interior of the home. He found himself looking around at the polished surfaces and wondering exactly how much a luxury apartment like this would cost in the city. Even though the house was beautiful and impressive, his instinct for survival was much stronger than his curiosity, and he felt a desperate urge to get out of there as quickly as humanly possible. The manager made himself right at home and told his two guests to relax on the sofa while he went to find something special he had prepared just for this day. He mentioned that it might take him a bit of time to locate what he was looking for and disappeared into another room, leaving the subordinates in a silence so thick it felt like the air had turned to lead. Inchul sat on the edge of the cushion, with his heart hammering against his ribs, trying his best to look anywhere but at the woman sitting beside him. He secretly reflected on how Yiju possessed such a beautiful and idyllic appearance, which only made it more of a tragedy that her personality was so unpredictable and borderline terrifying. He was gripped by a legitimate fear that she might try to pull another stunt now that they were alone in the manager's living room, and he worried that his professional life would never recover. He gripped his hands together in a state of high-tension prayer, hoping that the night would somehow end without a major catastrophe. The quiet atmosphere was finally broken when Yiju began to share a story about her childhood, looking off into the distance with a thoughtful expression. She turned her gaze toward Inchul and casually mentioned that when she was young, she once raised a small and ugly dog that looked exactly like him. Yiju continued her story about a small dog she had owned as a child, reflecting on how it used to follow her everywhere she went. She admitted that she found the constant attention quite annoying back then and didn't really appreciate the animal's loyalty. However, she slowly began to feel a sense of attachment as the days went by, only for that bond to be shattered in a single moment. She stood in the street in total shock after witnessing the dog meet a tragic end under the wheels of a large truck, leaving her with a lingering sense of regret because it had left her so suddenly. She made a firm decision that day to enjoy her interactions with others to the absolute fullest so that she would never have to experience that kind of sadness again. Inchul felt a wave of nervous energy as she looked at him with a mysterious expression and began to reach out, making him wonder why she was sharing such a heavy memory while simultaneously making a move on him. He struggled to stay calm while sitting in his superior's living room, feeling like the situation was becoming far too risky for a professional setting. Just as he felt he was about to lose his composure entirely, the voice of manager Manu echoed from the other room, asking for someone to come and help him find some misplaced items. Inchul let out a silent cry of pure gratitude, jumping to his feet with more enthusiasm than he had ever shown for a work task. He bolted toward the hallway, feeling like he had just been rescued from a very dangerous moment, while Yiju simply watched him go with a calm and knowing smile. The atmosphere shifted as the group eventually gathered around a coffee table to begin a high-stakes game of Jenga. Manager Minu explained the rules with a confident grin, making it clear that anyone who caused the tower to fall would have to face the punishment of a strong shot of whiskey. He claimed to have plenty of experience from his days in a board game club and successfully pulled the first block with practiced ease. Inchul watched the wooden blocks with intense focus, realizing that his own professional survival depended on his steady hands. However, the game took a sudden turn when Yiju reached out and accidentally sent the entire structure tumbling across the table on her very first try. Minu seemed remarkably pleased by her failure and quickly poured a generous shot for her, which she swallowed without a second thought. Inchul watched the exchange and realized that the manager was likely trying to lower her defenses by encouraging her to drink more. The cycle repeated itself as the night went on, with Yeju failing her turns until she had consumed far more than anyone else at the table. Inchul kept a careful count of the progress, noting that while Yeju was at 13 shots and the manager was at 7, even his boss was starting to look a bit tipsy. The strategy hit a major snag when Yeju decided to change her approach, leaning toward the manager and suggesting that he should take the next drink on her behalf. She used a soft tone to ask if he would be her protector for the round, and Manu found himself completely unable to resist the request. He grabbed the glass and finished it off, leaving Inchul in a state of silent panic. The rookie realized that if the manager kept drinking for both of them, the entire flow of the evening would be ruined, because his boss would be the first one to lose consciousness. He watched with a worried expression as the manager seemed to be heading straight toward a total knockout. The Jenga game reached its inevitable and messy conclusion as the wooden blocks clattered across the table once more, leaving manager Minu staring in total disbelief at the pile of failure. Yeju did not skip a beat, immediately pouring another shot of the strong liquid and offering it to her boss with a steady hand. Minu tried to be a good sport and swallowed the drink, but his coordination was clearly fading fast as the tower collapsed again almost instantly. Yeju seemed to be enjoying herself far too much, tilting the bottle to fill his glass yet again, while maintaining a calm and mysterious smile. Minu gave it his best effort and finished the drink, but the final crash of the wooden blocks was the last thing he heard before his world went completely dark. The manager tumbled off his seat and landed flat on his back on the floor, letting out a heavy groan before falling into a deep and immovable slumber. Inchul watched the scene in a state of absolute panic, silently wondering why his boss had been reckless enough to keep drinking for her. He realized that the entire plan for a normal evening had been destroyed because the person meant to keep things professional was now out for the count right in the middle of the living room. While Inchul was busy worrying, Yeju showed no signs of being affected by the massive amount of alcohol she had already consumed. She casually picked up the entire bottle and took a long drink directly from it, letting out a relaxed sigh and noting that the manager was surprisingly weak. Inchul looked over at her and realized that he was dealing with a literal monster who could outdrink anyone in the Frest building. Driven by a sudden instinct for survival, he decided that his only hope was to make a run for the exit and leave the chaos behind. He scrambled to his feet and stammered about needing to head home immediately, hoping that he could slip away while the manager was still snoring. However, his escape plan was cut short when Yeju's hand suddenly darted out and grabbed him by the face with surprising strength. Before he could even process what was happening, she pulled him into a sudden and very sussy moment that left him completely frozen in shock. When she finally pulled away, she stared at him with a dazed and focused intensity that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Inchul felt a surge of genuine terror as she pushed him for a cardio session, ignoring his frantic realizations that their boss was sleeping just a few inches away. Inchul was absolutely convinced that his life was about to end if he didn't act immediately, as the fear of being caught in such a compromising position by his sleeping manager was reaching a boiling point. In a move of pure desperation and very questionable logic, he decided the only way to avoid a total office scandal was to literally bundle up his problem and carry it away. He found a massive white laundry bag and proceeded to stuff the chaotic assistant manager inside, ignoring her muffled protests as he lugged her out of the apartment like a panicked burglar, making off with a very vocal prize. As he sprinted through the quiet hallways and out into the night, he felt his muscles screaming under the weight of his superior and her clothes. The absurdity of the moment hit a new peak when Yeju popped her head out of the sack and burst into a fit of laughter, declaring that he looked exactly like a very stressed and disheveled version of Santa Claus. Inchul could only grit his teeth and keep moving through the streets, realizing that impulsive decisions usually lead to very heavy and embarrassing consequences. Eventually, the frantic escape settled into a much slower pace as he carried her on his back through the city. Yeju seemed remarkably relaxed as she took a slow puff from her electronic cigarette, finally deciding to clear the air about the rumors surrounding her and manager Minu. She explained that there was actually nothing going on between them and that the manager had simply confessed his feelings one day. She had told him to do whatever he wanted, which he apparently misinterpreted as an invitation to become her overly devoted protector. Inchul was genuinely surprised to learn that she possessed a shred of common sense and wasn't just trying to ruin his life for fun, feeling that they might finally be even after the chaos of the night. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of chirping birds, but Inchul remained pinned to his bed while staring at the ceiling in a state of total confusion. He reflected on how bizarre his second chance at life had become, noting the irony that a man with zero outing experience was suddenly the center of attention for multiple women. He realized that these encounters couldn't possibly be a coincidence, and that there had to be a deeper meaning behind his return to the past. His thoughts eventually drifted back to the intense words of the shaman he had met before his journey began. He remembered her shouting about a massive cloud of energy at his workplace and how his presence was a necessary blessing for everyone there. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he sat up and decided that she was the only person who could explain the rules of his new existence. He threw on a hoodie and headed out into the morning sun, though he felt a lingering sense of doubt about whether the mysterious woman would even be at her shop, since he was currently living 3 years in the past. Inchul wandered through the neighborhood with a look of deep concentration, certain that the shaman's shop was nearby, but struggling to pinpoint the exact building in this familiar yet distant version of the city. His search finally came to an end when he spotted a surprisingly flashy sign for the Las Vegas temple, which looked far more like a neon-lit attraction than the traditional spiritual sanctuary he had been expecting. He stood before the entrance and felt a wave of relief as he realized that the establishment still existed 3 years in the past, confirming that at least some things remained consistent in his chaotic new reality. He stepped inside and moved cautiously through the quiet hallway, feeling a familiar sense of unease as he pushed open the sliding door to the main room. The priestess was already busy with her spiritual duties, closing her eyes and chanting softly while shaking a set of golden bells that filled the air with a rhythmic jingle. Inchul watched her for a moment from the doorway, hesitating to interrupt the ritual until he finally found the courage to speak up and mention that he had come seeking guidance for a very troubling situation. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered in an instant when the shaman's eyes snapped open with a terrifying intensity. She didn't offer a warm welcome, but instead immediately began shouting at him, calling him a brat and insisting that this was definitely not his first time standing in her temple. Inchul scrambled backward in total shock, his heart racing as he tried to understand how she could possibly recognize him when they hadn't technically met yet in this specific timeline. He felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized that his secret might be even harder to hide than he originally thought. However, the woman suddenly stopped her tirade and tilted her head in genuine confusion, admitting that she had never actually seen his face before. She felt a strange contradiction, because while he looked like a total stranger, her divine lord was whispering to her that he was a frequent visitor who had sought her help many times. Inchul could only offer a nervous laugh and scratch the back of his head, realizing that his spiritual footprint from the future was apparently leaking into his past in a very confusing way. The priestess eventually settled down and asked what had brought him to her door, leading Inchul to take a seat and prepare himself for a very difficult explanation. He looked down at the floor and crossed his arms, wondering how he could possibly describe his life without sounding like he had completely lost his mind. He cautiously shared how he had become unexpectedly tied up with several women who didn't seem to be part of his original destiny, admitting that he felt like there was some kind of hidden meaning behind all the intense and sudden connections he was experiencing. He looked at the shaman with a look of desperate hope, wondering if he would truly be okay or if his life was heading toward a total disaster. The woman listened to his story with a serious expression before snapping her fan shut with a sharp sound that signaled the end of her consultation. She stated with an air of absolute authority that her lord had finally provided an answer to his dilemma and commanded him to listen well to the instructions she was about to give. Inchul swallowed hard and leaned in, bracing himself. The shaman delivered a very specific instruction for Inchul to go east and told him to listen carefully because he needed to engrave her words into his head. She explained that he had been wandering around, spreading his energy like a particularly active puppy, which was actually a good thing because he was dispelling the heavy negative energy surrounding the people in his life. Inchul stood there in total shock as he realized that he was the only person capable of performing this very unique and exhausting task. He wondered if he was really supposed to keep living his life this way, but the shaman confirmed that his actions were helping everyone, even if the path ahead would be quite difficult. She gave him a serious look and warned that his mission would only be successful if he made sure that absolutely no one was left out. As Inchul walked through the sunny streets, he reflected on how the shaman was still talking about the same cloud of energy that he had heard about during his very first visit. He began to piece the puzzle together and realized that there was definitely some sort of outside power at play, which meant his new responsibility involved being there for every single woman at the company. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk and let the weight of that realization settle in while trying to figure out what the instruction to go east actually meant for his immediate future. He suddenly remembered that there was a gym located exactly to the east of the company building, and he recalled how Sarah had once mentioned going there to stay in shape. He arrived at the fitness center and was immediately met with the sight of assistant manager Sarah working hard on her routine. She looked up in total surprise and greeted him with a bright smile because she never expected to run into her new colleague in such a casual setting. Inchul laughed nervously and explained that his health had been declining lately, so he decided it was finally time to start exercising regularly. Sarah assumed that the manager's constant advice about staying fit had finally gotten to him, and she told him not to worry about it too much. Inchul felt a rush of happiness as he realized she actually remembered their previous conversations, and he stood there in a daze while she asked if he had already started his workout for the day. He admitted that he was a complete beginner and had no idea where to even begin with all the heavy equipment. Sarah took pity on the confused rookie and offered to teach him a few basic techniques, starting with the deadlift. She demonstrated the proper form by placing her feet shoulder-width apart and showing him exactly how to raise the bar to knee level without getting injured. Inchul watched her with wide eyes and felt his heart racing as he tried to focus on the professional advice instead of the very distracting view in front of him. She encouraged him to come closer and look from behind so he could see the proper alignment of her back. She then made the bold suggestion for him to reach out and grab her so he could feel the muscle tension for himself, because feeling it directly was the only way to truly understand how to maintain the correct posture. Inchul was absolutely stunned by the request and hesitated for a moment before carefully placing his hands on her waist. The intensity of the moment was becoming far too much for him to handle, and he suddenly felt a very embarrassing and noticeable sussy reaction. He realized he had to find a way to handle his situation immediately before things became awkward, but his panic only made him lose his balance entirely. He ended up accidentally stumbling forward and pushing into her, which caused them both to fall toward the floor in a very sussy position. Inchul found himself in a truly impossible situation as he hovered directly over assistant manager Sarah on the soft gym mat. He was internally screaming about how badly he had messed up, yet his heart refused to listen and continued to throb with a life of its own. He looked down into her wide eyes and realized that while he meant to be a helpful trainee, he had instead become a source of total confusion. The sound of the door creaking open shattered the heavy silence as a pair of athletic shoes stepped into the stretching room. Assistant manager Yeju stood in the doorway, clutching her water bottle, and looked down at the two of them with an expression that was equal parts shocked and fascinated. She noted that it was finally her turn to use the space and wondered what exactly the two of them were doing on the floor, while Inchul froze like a deer in the brightest headlights imaginable. Sarah scrambled to her feet in a state of absolute panic and quickly tried to explain that she was simply showing the new guy the ropes since it was his very first time working out. She did not wait around for a reply and practically bolted out of the room while handing the rest of the session over to Yeju. Inchul watched her go and felt a deep sense of loss as her ponytail swayed out of sight, leaving him alone with the most unpredictable woman in the building. The atmosphere changed immediately as Yeju reached back and locked the door with a chilling click that made Inchul's skin crawl. She walked toward him with a slow and purposeful stride while noting how impressive it was for a rookie to try and make such a bold move on the most popular girl in the office. Inchul tried to argue that it was just a simple accident during a stretching session, but Yeju pointed out that his body was telling a very different and much more energetic story. She leaned down and noted that his enthusiasm was quite difficult to explain away, which made Inchul realize he was completely at her mercy once again. He remembered the priestess's warning that avoiding these situations was not the path to success, and he decided that if his mission was to help everyone, then he needed to stop being a passive observer. Instead of offering another weak apology, he leaned forward and pulled Yeju into a sudden cardio gesture that left her completely speechless and wide-eyed with shock. She eventually pushed him away and demanded to know how he had the nerve to do such a thing without even asking for her permission first. Inchul stood his ground and reminded her that she was the one who had been toying with him from the very beginning, so she should not be so surprised when he finally decided to play by his own rules. He reached out and grabbed her with a level of confidence he did not know he possessed, and Yeju found herself feeling a strange mix of irritation and genuine admiration for the man. Later that day, at a place called Coffee Road, Inchul was doing his absolute best to explain himself to a very silent Sue. He claimed that the manager had been working him to the bone with tedious tasks and overtime ever since they got back from the business trip, which was why he had been so hard to reach. Sue sat there with her arms crossed, looking like she was carefully weighing his words, while Inchul struggled to read her expression and wondered if she suspected something more. She eventually admitted that her cold behavior was actually just a cover for her genuine worry that something bad had happened to him. Inchul was so relieved by her honesty that he immediately offered to do whatever she wanted for the rest of the day as a way to make amends. Sue's mood shifted instantly as she asked if he was really willing to follow her every command, and she soon led him toward their next destination. Inchul was surprised when they arrived at a local premium comic book cafe, and he wondered if this was really the right place for their outing. Sue teased him about whether he expected her to kidnap him and take him somewhere more sinister, but he simply laughed and admitted that he actually quite enjoyed reading comics. She found it incredibly fun to tease him and watched with a sly smile as he admired how large and comfortable the building was. He noted that it was a far cry from the musty and smoke-filled rooms he remembered from his high school days, and he felt like he was experiencing a whole new world. They eventually ordered a massive feast of fried chicken and fish cakes on her treat, and Inchul realized that his superior was truly one of a kind. They settled into a private corner to relax and read, but the peaceful atmosphere was soon interrupted by some very sussy sounds coming from the booth right next to theirs. Inchul tried to focus on his book while internally judging the neighbors for their lack of public decorum and wishing they had just gone to a room instead. The heavy breathing from the other room was making it very difficult to stay calm, and he felt a cold sweat breaking out as the situation became increasingly awkward. Suai noticed that he was becoming incredibly flustered and pointed out that he was having quite a noticeable reaction for someone who was no longer a child. Inchul was mortified and tried to explain that it was just a natural reflex caused by the embarrassing environment and not a sign of anything else. Much to his surprise, Sue didn't seem annoyed and instead noted that she really couldn't stop him from being so energetic. She leaned over and slowly closed the curtains of their booth, while admitting that she didn't exactly dislike the way he was acting. Inchul realized that his superior looked incredibly charming when she was embarrassed, and he decided that there was absolutely no reason for him to back out now. A few days passed, and Inchul found himself standing under a large umbrella in the middle of a heavy rainstorm at night. He checked his phone and realized he had been waiting for over 15 minutes already, which made him wonder if the person he was supposed to meet had gotten lost or decided to skip out. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had been relaxing at home while scrolling through a secondhand marketplace app called Great Market. He had let out a gasp of excitement when he found a listing for an out-of-print comic series he used to be a huge fan of back in the day. Even though the series had a bit of a reputation for being spicy, he felt a deep sense of nostalgia and decided to pay the high price to secure the collection for himself. He had arranged a quick meetup at Sky Park, but because the books were a little embarrassing, he decided to wear a hat and pull it down low to hide his identity. The sound of footsteps splashing in, the puddles caught his attention, and he jumped slightly when a woman carrying a paper bag appeared right behind him. She apologized for the delay and explained that she had briefly fallen asleep, but she added a few extra volumes as compensation for making him wait. Inchul looked at her through the rain and felt his heart skip a beat as he noticed something incredibly familiar about her eyes behind the mask. He tried to convince himself that he was just overthinking things, but the realization hit him like a lightning bolt that the seller was none other than assistant manager Sarah. He tentatively spoke her name and watched as her eyes widened in total shock while she tried to figure out how this stranger knew who she was. Inchul lifted his hat to show his face, and Sarah looked like she was about to faint from the sheer awkwardness of the situation. She immediately began to stammer through a series of frantic excuses and claimed that she was definitely not the kind of person who would actually read those sorts of comics. In her desperate attempt to hide the evidence, she clutched the bag too tightly, and the book suddenly spilled out and landed directly in the wet mud. Inchul cried out in panic because he knew those volumes were nearly impossible to find, and he didn't want them to be ruined. As he knelt down to gather the books, a small piece of paper slipped out from one of the covers and fluttered onto the ground. His confusion turned into total disbelief when he saw that it was actually a printed photo of himself smiling while holding a beverage. He was left standing in the rain in a state of complete bewilderment as he tried to understand why his most popular coworker would be carrying around a secret picture of him inside a collection of sussy comics. Inchul stared down at the wet pavement, feeling a surge of panic as his rare comic books took a direct hit from the relentless rain. He scrambled to gather the scattered volumes, but his heart nearly stopped when a small slip of paper drifted out from between the damp pages. It was a clear photo of himself, looking cheerful while holding a drink, and he found himself completely baffled as to why a picture of his own face was hiding inside a collection of sussy stories. He looked up to see assistant manager Sarah standing there in total mortification, her eyes darting around behind her mask as if she were searching for a hole to crawl into. The sheer weight of the embarrassment proved to be too much for her system to handle, and she suddenly collapsed right there in the rain, leaving Inchul to wonder how a simple trade had turned into a medical emergency. With no other options available, he carefully carried the unconscious Sarah back to the safety of his apartment, where the sound of her heavy breathing filled the quiet room. As she lay on his floor, the blurry reality of her surroundings slowly began to come into focus, and she felt a jolt of terror as she realized she had ended up in Inchul's private home. She remembered the disaster at the park and began to whisper a series of frantic apologies to herself, convinced that her secret hobby had finally destroyed her reputation. Her mind raced with the realization that she had used that specific photo to fuel her own private cardio sessions, and she felt a wave of absolute shame as she worried that Inchul would now see her as a total degenerate. Inchul sat nearby in a cold sweat, watching her shiver and wondering if the comic books were really the reason she was so upset. He noticed that her clothes were completely soaked and reflected on how movies usually handled this kind of situation by having the hero help the lady change. However, He quickly delivered a sharp slap to his own face, sternly reminding himself that his future freedom depended on remaining a perfect gentleman. He realized that he was only one impulsive decision away from a very unfortunate legal situation, and determined that he would focus strictly on her health instead of his own wandering thoughts. He decided that the best course of action was to help her dry off without overstepping his boundaries, so he grabbed a clean towel and began a mission of mercy. He started by carefully wiping the dampness from her back and waist, trying his best to be professional while his heart hammered against his ribs. She convinced herself that the intense scenes from her favorite stories were finally becoming a reality, and she worried that if he kept going, she might not be able to control her own reactions. She looked at him with a dazed expression, realizing that the man she had only ever admired from afar was actually even more kind and considerate than she had imagined. Inchul noticed that her face was turning a bright shade of red and assumed that she must be developing a dangerous fever from her time in the storm. He leaned in to wipe the moisture from her forehead, his mind focused entirely on the potential medical emergency unfolding in front of him. Sarah watched him and felt her heart racing. She realized that she couldn't live as a quiet observer forever, and decided that if it was going to be with Inchul, she was ready to experience everything she had only ever read about. Just as the tension reached its peak, Inchul suddenly pulled away, declaring to himself that he needed to stop the drying mission and sprint to the local pharmacy for some proper medicine before her condition worsened. He stood up to leave, but he didn't even make it a single step before Sarah's hand darted out and grabbed his arm with surprising strength. She looked up at him with a desperate and hopeful gaze, telling him that he didn't need to go anywhere because she wasn't actually sick at all. The night air was still and quiet outside the apartment building, but inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to be cut with a knife. After their intense marathon of cardio energy had finally reached its conclusion, Inchul and Sarah found themselves sitting on the floor in a state of peak awkwardness. Inchul stared off into space, reflecting on how quickly they had moved from a rainy park to such a high-stakes cardio session. He realized that they couldn't just sit there in silence forever, and decided he needed to be the one to break the ice before things became even more uncomfortable. He tentatively called out to her and suggested that, since they had quite a bit to discuss, a few cold drinks might be the best way to relax. Sarah offered a polite nod, and soon they were facing each other over a small table with several cans of beer. Inchul noted that this was a historic occasion, since it was the very first time they had ever shared a drink outside of a company event. Sarah admitted that she was actually quite bad at handling alcohol, and mentioned that her parents were incredibly strict about such habits. Inchul immediately felt like a bad influence, and offered to bring her a soda instead, so she wouldn't feel forced to keep up with him. Sarah let out a genuine laugh, and told him that it was perfectly fine, because for one night, she wanted to forget about every single rule she had ever been taught. To Inchul's absolute disbelief, the refined and graceful assistant manager proceeded to chug her entire can in a matter of seconds. He watched in a state of total shock as she immediately reached for another one, wondering if he was witnessing a medical miracle or a total collapse of her professional self-control. The sudden influx of bubbles brought on a predictable case of hiccups, which only made her look even more flustered as she looked him in the eye. She confessed that everything he thought he knew about her was a total lie, and admitted that she had actually spent a long time wanting to be more like him. Inchul was completely baffled by this revelation and pointed toward the bags of trash in the corner, insisting that he was just a messy guy who wasn't particularly good at anything. He argued that he was the one who should be aspiring to be like her, because she was beautiful, athletic, and far more competent at her job, despite being the younger one. Sarah listened with a mysterious smile before explaining the reality of her privileged childhood. She described how her parents were powerful corporate executives who expected her to be the perfect, ideal daughter at every moment. She felt like she had lived her entire life as a doll, trapped by the constant pressure of living up to their impossible standards. She revealed that her secret collection of sussy cardio comics and her hidden desires were the only reward she allowed herself for being so obedient. She called herself a bit of an idiot for using such things to relieve her cardio stress, but she admitted it was the only escape she could find from her rigid existence. Inchul was stunned by this unexpected confession, never imagining that the office idol was carrying such a heavy burden. Sarah continued by saying that because of him, she had felt something she never even dreamed possible, and noted that everything she had experienced before meeting him felt like child's play. She looked at him with a dazed and focused intensity, declaring that she found him to be incredibly cool and brave. Before Inchul could even process the compliment, she began crawling toward him with an energy that made his heart skip a beat. He nervously suggested that she might be a bit too drunk, and wondered if they should head outside for a brisk walk to help her calm down. Sarah didn't listen to his logic and told him that there was absolutely no time for such idle chatter. She made it very clear that she wasn't nearly satisfied with their earlier performance and insisted that they start another round of intense cardio immediately. While Inchul and Sarah are lost in a deep and well-earned slumber after their intense cardio session, Inchul's phone is working overtime as it vibrates relentlessly on the floor. The caller is none other than a very restless Yeju, who is currently finding the silence from the other end to be absolutely insulting. Back in the quiet of her own home, she paces around in her pajamas and realizes that the rookie might have finally lost his mind by choosing to ignore her calls for so long. She stops to face her own reflection in the mirror, sternly telling herself to get a grip before her frustration completely takes over. As she stands there, her mind begins to drift back through their recent history, replaying those high-energy moments at the manager's house and their frantic cardio practice at the fitness center. She is hit with the sudden and irritating realization that Inchul has actually been the one steering the ship during every single encounter they have had so far. The idea that she has been the one following his lead this entire time is a bitter pill to swallow, and she decides that she cannot just sit around and do nothing while her authority is being challenged. She knows it is finally time to show him who really holds the power in this office dynamic, and vows not to let him have the upper hand any longer. She marches over to her private closet and swings the door open to reveal a specialized collection of outfits and gear meant for taking total command of any situation. A satisfied grin crosses her lips as she reaches for a sussy authority uniform, fully convinced that a change in attire is exactly what she needs to regain her status. She holds the outfit up with a look of pure determination, realizing that her only remaining task is to remember the exact location of his apartment so she can bring the discipline directly to his doorstep. Inchul was deep in sleep when a sudden jolt of terror shot through his system. He felt as if his entire life was flashing before his eyes in a series of vivid memories from the night before, and his heart raced as he struggled with the terrifying realization that he might be getting sent back in time once again. He was convinced that the universe was about to hit the reset button just as things were getting interesting, and he braced himself for the impact of a new timeline. When he finally opened his eyes, he was met with the familiar sight of his own ceiling and realized with a massive wave of relief that he hadn't traveled back to the past after all. He reached out and felt the warm reality of the situation, confirming that Sarah was still right there beside him as he let out a long breath of pure gratitude. Not long after, Sarah slowly blinked her eyes open while nursing a rather impressive headache from her adventures with the beer cans. She sat up on the floor and noticed the empty containers scattered across the table, including a very helpful hangover remedy that had been left for her. As the fog in her mind finally began to clear, a sudden and vivid memory of their intense activities from the night before hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She buried her face in her hands and felt her cheeks burning with absolute mortification, wondering how she could ever look at her colleague with a straight face again after being so bold. However, the initial shock quickly transformed into a hidden and very satisfied smile as she reflected on the details of the night. She realized that the experience had been far beyond anything she had ever read about in her sussy comics, and found herself feeling more alive than she had in years. She hugged her knees in a burst of quiet excitement, secretly hoping that they would have many more opportunities to practice their high-energy teamwork together. She eventually noticed that Inchul was nowhere to be found and decided that the least she could do was start cleaning up the messy apartment as a way to show her appreciation. Meanwhile, Inchul was already out in the morning sun, clutching a plastic bag filled with ingredients for his legendary trademark hangover ramen. He reflected on his early morning scare, noting how strange it was that his life didn't reset this time around, despite the intensity of the night. His mind briefly drifted toward a ridiculous thought about whether the stern team leader would eventually be part of his energy-spreading mission as well, but he quickly shook his head to clear the distraction. He firmly told himself that he needed to stay focused on Sarah for the time being and vowed to stop letting his imagination run wild. His plan for a peaceful breakfast was shattered when he looked down the street and spotted a very familiar and very stylish figure. He stood frozen in total disbelief as he realized that assistant manager Yeju was currently wandering through his very own neighborhood so early in the morning. He couldn't help but feel a sudden chill down his spine, wondering what on earth she was doing there. Inchul's first instinct upon spotting the very stylish and very annoyed assistant manager Yeju was to perform a tactical retreat, but his plan to simply look away and keep walking failed before it even started. He tried to convince himself that he didn't hear her shouting his name, desperately hoping that if he ignored her long enough, she might just disappear back into the morning fog. His heart skipped a beat when he felt her firm grip on his shoulder, and he realized that pretending to be a complete stranger in his own neighborhood was no longer a viable option. He pivoted with a nervous laugh and tried to sell the idea that their meeting was a massive coincidence, but Yeju wasn't buying a single word of it. She made it very clear that her presence there was entirely intentional, admitting that she had been losing quite a bit of sleep over a certain rude little puppy who refused to answer his phone. Inchul felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized she was definitely talking about him and wondered how his morning could have taken such a sharp turn for the worse. His internal panic reached a new peak when Yiju announced that she was getting hungry and commanded him to take her straight to his apartment for a meal. He desperately tried to suggest that they should visit one of the many nice places in the area instead, thinking that any location was better than the room where Sarah was currently recovering. Yiju found his sudden interest in local places to be highly suspicious, and noted that his frantic behavior only made her more determined to see what he was hiding behind his front door. Inchul felt like a man, walking toward his own execution as they reached the hallway, his mind racing with terrifying images of Yiju and Sarah finally crossing paths. He fumbled with his keys in a state of total despair, certain that this was the exact moment his professional life would go up in flames. He slowly pushed the door open while bracing for a loud exclamation from his hidden guest, but he was met with a silence that felt almost impossible. To his absolute shock and confusion, the apartment was completely empty and looked far neater than it had when he left. He scanned the room with wide eyes and realized that Sarah must have finished her cleaning mission and headed home while he was out at the store. He let out a massive sigh of relief that he managed to avoid the greatest disaster of his second life, though he felt a bit embarrassed that his superior was now judging the tidiness of his private sanctuary. Yiju admitted that the place was much cleaner than she expected, but noted that the lack of a secret guest was a bit of a letdown for her investigative curiosity. However, the sense of safety was only temporary because Yiju quickly shifted the focus back to the primary reason for her visit. She brushed her hair back with a mysterious look and mentioned that they still had the main course to look forward to, reaching into her bag to reveal the specialized authority uniform she had prepared. Inchul felt his breath catch in his throat as the professional atmosphere evaporated instantly, leaving him trapped in the intense gaze of his boss. She leaned against the door with a confident smile and informed her favorite little pet that it was finally time for them to start their morning session of play. Inchul looked at the stylish woman standing in his doorway and felt a wave of genuine concern about her mention of play. He realized he could not allow himself to get sucked into whatever unpredictable plan she had in store for him. In a frantic attempt to change the subject, he wondered if she had managed to eat breakfast yet, which caught her completely off guard. Yiju felt a bit insulted by the question and reminded him that she had rushed over as soon as she possibly could. Inchul stayed focused on his hospitality and suggested they have a meal first, since he had just returned from the grocery store. He promised it wouldn't take very long, and Yiju found herself agreeing with a confused expression. She sat on the floor and watched him, wondering why he was being so unusually nice today. She noticed her bag sitting nearby and remembered the specialized authority uniform she had brought along specifically to show him who was boss. Her mind drifted back to their previous encounters, and she realized he had never shown this level of consideration before. The silence of the room was soon filled with the aroma of steaming noodles as Inchul placed a bowl on the table. Yiju assumed it wouldn't be anything special and felt slightly annoyed that he was making such a big deal over a simple bowl of ramen. However, as soon as she took the first bite, her eyes widened in total disbelief at the incredible flavor. Inchul watched with a blissful and proud smile, knowing that his masterpiece was a recipe that had earned the approval of all his friends. He even reminded her to eat quickly before the noodles soaked up too much of the soup and lost their perfect texture. As the meal concluded, Inchul noticed the large bag again and asked what all those items were for. Yiju felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and made up a quick lie about them being her workout clothes. She wondered what was wrong with her and why she was acting so flustered in front of her subordinate. Inchul stood up to clear the table and suggested she take some rest while he finished the cleaning, even promising to bring her dessert afterward. Yiju headed toward the washroom, feeling overwhelmed by how considerate he was being. She stared at herself in the mirror and felt her competitive spirit returning, deciding that she could not let this little punk get away with being so charming. Back in the kitchen, Inchul hummed a little tune while washing the dishes, thinking to himself that he could send her home soon and finally find the time to call Sarah. His peaceful moment was shattered by a sudden metallic click as a pair of handcuffs locked around his wrists. He spun around in total shock to find Yiju standing right behind him, having changed into a full cardio costume. He was completely speechless and wondered what she was doing and why she had chosen such a detailed outfit for their morning. Yiju commanded him to shut up and answer her questions, warning him that things were about to get very difficult if he didn't cooperate. She reached out and held up a long strand of hair she found on the floor, demanding to know exactly which woman it belonged to. Inchul felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized the evidence of Sarah's visit was staring him right in the face. He tried to claim the hair was obviously his own, but Yiju found that explanation to be insulting. She noted that he clearly wasn't going to fess up and decided that it would be much more fun to see how much pressure he could take. Inchul pleaded with her to let him out of the cuffs so they could just talk like normal people, but Yiju was far too committed to her new role. She enjoyed seeing him groveling on the floor and mentioned that the position suited him perfectly. Inchul realized with a jolt of terror that he had not been taking her seriously enough and concluded that she was truly a wild and unpredictable person. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he suddenly remembered a brilliant excuse. He shouted that the hair must have come from the secondhand comic books he had purchased earlier that day. He frantically explained that the seller was a woman and even offered to show her the transaction records as proof. Yiju took a moment to consider his story, looking through the bag of books with a serious expression. She noted that it was a decent excuse and realized he was likely telling the truth after seeing the messages and a photo of him tucked inside one of the volumes. She decided to let the matter go just this once, even though she still found his behavior highly suspicious. However, she made it very clear that he had still managed to make her angry, so their cardio session was definitely going to continue. She stood over him with a renewed sense of authority and told her favorite prisoner that it was finally time for him to get to work. Later, the secret witness to the morning's chaos was tucked away in the shadows of the wardrobe as Sarah struggled to catch her breath while clutching her knees. She peered through the narrow crack of the door and felt a wave of disbelief as she processed the scene of clothes and metallic cardio gears left on the floor. It dawned on her that Inchul and assistant manager Yiju were far closer than she ever imagined, and she realized that the man she had just seen was a far cry from the considerate person she thought she knew. She found herself questioning which version of him was the real one, while her heart raced with a mix of shock and confusion. She remembered her own confession and the way he had claimed to think of her in private, leading her to conclude that he must still have feelings for her, regardless of whatever antics he was up to with Yiju. Monday morning arrived with a heavy sense of irony as Inchul walked toward the office, reflecting on how lucky he was that Sarah had gone home early on Friday. He shuddered at the thought of what would have happened if they had been caught in the storage room and worried that such a disaster might have triggered another reset to the very beginning of his journey. He decided that his best strategy was to act as normal as possible around Sarah, though his confidence wavered the moment he spotted her standing with manager Minwoo near the elevator. He offered a polite greeting and noted that Sarah seemed to be handling everything with her usual professional grace, as if the weekend hadn't happened at all. The quiet atmosphere of the elevator was shattered when a hand suddenly blocked the closing doors and Yiju stepped inside with a triumphant smile. Inchul noticed a small bandage on her neck and felt a cold sweat breaking out when Minwoo asked if she had been attacked by a local mosquito. Yiju didn't miss a beat as she looked directly at the rookie and grumbled about a tiny and rather annoying mosquito that had been all over her until the area became red and swollen. Inchul bowed his head in a state of high-tension embarrassment while Sarah watched the exchange from the side, her silent profile giving away nothing of the storm brewing inside her. As the elevator grew more crowded, Inchul felt a sudden and very bold touch on his lower back that made his eyes nearly pop out of his head. He realized Yiju was shamelessly taking advantage of the tight space to tease him right in front of their colleagues, and he desperately wished the floor would just open up and swallow him whole. Sarah noticed the subtle movement and felt a surge of silent fury, realizing that Yiju was overstepping her boundaries in a professional setting. She gripped her phone tightly and vowed that she wasn't going to let anyone get away with such behavior toward her favorite coworker. Back at her desk, Sarah's usual calm exterior began to crack as she stared at her computer screen with a dark and focused intensity. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic speed that caught the attention of her nearby colleagues, who wondered if something terrible had happened to her. She wasn't working on travel reports, but was instead typing a repetitive and chilling message about how someone was definitely not going to get away with their actions. She reflected on the secret encounter she had witnessed and felt her jealousy reaching a boiling point, wondering who Inchul truly had in mind while his superior continued to toy with him. The workday dragged on until Inchul found himself slumped in his chair, feeling like he had failed to resolve anything because Sarah had taken the entire afternoon off. He planned to call her on his way home to clear the air, but his phone suddenly buzzed with a series of messages that changed everything. His heart skipped a beat when he saw that Sarah was inviting him to her place for dinner, claiming that he looked exhausted and she wanted to treat him to a home-cooked meal. He didn't even need to think about his answer and headed straight for her apartment, convinced that this was the perfect opportunity to fix their relationship. He arrived at her door, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement, and was greeted by Sarah, looking incredibly stunning in her relaxed home attire. She welcomed him inside and pointed toward a massive feast she had prepared all by herself after taking the afternoon off to focus on her cooking. Inchul was absolutely floored by the variety of dishes and felt a deep sense of meaning in the fact that she had put so much effort into his visit. As he took his first bite, he felt like he had been struck by lightning because the flavors were far superior to anything he had ever tasted in a restaurant. He began to get emotional over the meal, telling her that he could literally taste the love and care she had poured into the food. Sarah watched him with a satisfied smile and eventually mentioned that there was something she had been quite curious about for a while. She leaned forward and suggested that perhaps having 3 people involved in a cardio situation was actually much better than just having 2. Inchul stopped chewing and stared at her in total confusion, wondering if she was talking about a professional team dynamic or something far more complicated. Sarah noticed his bewildered expression, but simply smiled and told him it was nothing important for the moment. As the dinner concluded, Sarah stood up and informed him that even though he was full, there was still one very special thing left for him to have. She explained that it was a delicious treat her mother had taught her how to prepare and told him to stay exactly where he was. Inchul watched in a daze as she didn't head for the kitchen. After the high-energy events of the evening had passed, a peaceful silence settled over the apartment as the clock ticked toward 8 in the evening. Inchul was completely knocked out on the sofa, with his head resting comfortably, while she looked down at him with a look of pure adoration. She found it hard to believe how incredibly cute he looked while he was sleeping, and she couldn't help but reach out to gently stroke his hair. As she watched him rest, she couldn't help but notice the contrast between his soft, sleeping expression and the surprising cardio energy he had shown earlier, which made her realize why he was so popular with the women in the office. Her tender moment soon shifted into a much more serious resolve as she gripped his head with a sudden burst of possessive determination. She reflected on the secret she had witnessed and decided that it was only natural for her to step up and ensure that no one else could lay a finger on him from now on. She made a firm, silent vow to herself that no matter who she had to compete with, she was absolutely never going to lose him to anyone else. The next morning, the two of them walked through the city streets together, enjoying the fresh air and the chatter of the morning commute. As they neared the office building, Inchul suggested that it might look a bit suspicious if they arrived at the front doors at the exact same time. Sarah realized he was right and agreed to let him head in first to maintain their professional cover. Inchul waved a happy goodbye and sprinted toward the building with a little tune on his lips, feeling much more confident about his future than he had just a few days ago. Inside the office, the atmosphere was already buzzing with activity and a bit of hidden drama. Sarah walked in with a bright smile, only to find Yeju watching her with a very skeptical expression while still wearing a bandage on her neck. Yeju tried to maintain her dominant superior act by asking if Sarah had also fallen victim to a persistent mosquito. Sarah didn't miss a beat and cheerfully confirmed that she had indeed been kept very busy all night long by a certain something that wouldn't let her get a wink of sleep. This direct callback to Yeju's own earlier excuse caused the older woman to tremble with pure frustration as she realized she had finally met her match in the battle for Inchul's attention. The competitive energy in the room was eventually broken when the team was summoned for their morning briefing. As the meeting concluded, Section Chief Hiren asked Inchul to stay behind for a private performance review. Inchul felt a jolt of nervous energy and wondered if his sussy activities had finally caught up with him or if he was about to get a lecture he wouldn't survive. Hiren sat across from him with a very serious face, making Inchul realize he could hardly stand the heavy silence as she scrolled through her tablet. She began by pointing out his attendance records, noting that he had been late twice in his first few months, which would normally be a major red flag for any rookie. Inchul started to sweat, convinced that he was about to be fired right on the spot. However, Hiren surprised him by admitting that his work performance and the speed at which he had adapted to the company were far beyond what she expected. She announced that the company was officially offering him a permanent position, which made Inchul's heart race with genuine excitement. He was so relieved and happy that he started bowing repeatedly, shouting his thanks with more energy than he had ever shown in the break room. Hiren told him to stop overreacting because the day was far from over and she needed him to accompany her to a very important dinner with the big boss. They soon arrived at a high-end traditional restaurant where the atmosphere was much more refined and elegant than their usual team hangouts. Inchul felt a wave of nerves as the sliding door opened to reveal the CEO himself, who entered the room. Inchul stood in the middle of the traditional dining room and stared at the man he believed was the CEO of his company. He had spent months hearing wild rumors about this mysterious leader, imagining someone as intimidating as a gang boss or as flashy as a billionaire playboy. Instead, he found himself face to face with a man who looked remarkably average, appearing more like a friendly neighbor than a powerful corporate executive. Hiren noticed his hesitation and gently prompted him to introduce himself. Inchul snapped out of his confusion and delivered a bow so deep it almost touched the floor, shouting his name with a level of energy that matched his nervousness. The older man adjusted his glasses and studied the rookie with a strange, squinting intensity that made Inchul feel like he was being scanned by a computer. The older man suddenly reached out his hand, and Inchul instinctively moved for a handshake. However, he was caught off guard when the CEO ignored his grip and instead grabbed his palm to inspect it closely. The man revealed that palm reading was his secret hobby and began to trace the lines on Inchul's hand with a look of growing concern. He noted that the lifeline was quite short and branched out in several different directions, leading him to deliver a very blunt conclusion that Inchul was simply destined for an early grave. Inchul stood frozen in a state of pure terror, but the tension was immediately broken when the older man burst into a fit of laughter. He patted Inchul on the shoulder and claimed he was only kidding, though the joke didn't do much to calm Inchul's racing heart. Hiren let out a long, weary sigh and told the boss to stop scaring the new employee so they could finally enjoy their dinner. The CEO offered a cheerful apology and insisted that his hobby was all in good fun as they took their seats at the massive table. As the meal began, the leader mentioned that he had heard nothing but high praise for the rookie's performance. He noted that it was quite impressive for a new hire to show such talent so early on, but Inchul remained humble and insisted that he couldn't have accomplished anything without Hiren's constant guidance. He stole a quiet glance at her and reflected on how much their relationship had transformed compared to his previous life. He remembered a time when she was always upset with him, but now he realized that, since his return to the past, he had spent a significant amount of his energy having very frequent and intense interactions with almost every woman in the office. He found it hard to believe his luck was holding out, all thanks to the strange reset of time. The CEO sipped his drink and admitted that while he held the title, Hiren was the one truly running the entire operation. He acknowledged that the company would have likely gone bankrupt a long time ago if it weren't for her incredible efforts. He eventually turned the conversation toward Inchul's personal life, learning that the young man's parents were grape farmers in the countryside. The boss was so moved by this that he suggested they should send the hardworking couple on a luxury trip as a reward. Despite the friendly atmosphere, the CEO admitted to Hiren that he still felt something was a bit odd about the current staff. He found it strange how someone so ordinary looking could perform so well, and wondered if there was some kind of hidden intervention behind the recent hiring choices. Hiren agreed that they would have to keep a close eye on the situation for now, as they were all essentially on the same boat together. The private conversation was cut short when the sliding door flew open and manager Guak Sangdo practically tumbled into the room. He was a balding, cheerful man who immediately began bowing and rubbing the back of his head with an air of extreme subservience toward the big boss. He explained that he had heard they were meeting and simply wanted to drop by to pay his respects. A sudden disaster nearly ruined the evening when a server tripped on the polished floor, sending a tray of heavy dishes and cups flying through the air. While the others sat in stunned silence, the clumsy-looking manager Guak suddenly moved with the speed and precision of a professional athlete. He performed a series of impossible maneuvers, catching every single plate and cup before they could hit the ground or splash the guests. He landed perfectly in a mid-air pose and calmly told the terrified server to simply bring some fresh dishes. Inchul stepped out of the elegant building, feeling like the absolute king of the world. He could not quite wrap his head around the fact that he had just shared a meal with the CEO, who had essentially labeled him as the glorious future of the entire company. For a moment, he wondered if this was what the life of a high-status gentleman truly felt like, imagining a path to success paved with rapid promotions and corporate glory. He silently thanked the fortune teller for her guidance, convinced that the huge opportunity she promised was finally coming to fruition. However, a sudden chill of reality brought him back down to earth as he stopped in his tracks. He realized that, even with all his current success, he still had no idea why he was traveling back through time in the first place. A terrifying thought crossed his mind that he might simply wake up tomorrow, only to find the universe had hit the reset button once again, wiping away every bit of hard work he had poured into this new timeline. He felt a desperate need to cling to this life, realizing that he had worked far too hard to let it all slip through his fingers. He began to reflect on the shaman's cryptic instructions, remembering her insistence that being there for his female colleagues was the key to his mission. He had already established quite an intense connection with several coworkers, but his gaze eventually drifted toward team leader Hiren. He admitted to himself that he had always been far too intimidated by her strict professional demeanor to notice how incredibly attractive she actually was. With a newfound sense of purpose, he decided that the time for hesitation was over, and that he was ready to see where this new path would lead him. Back inside the restaurant, the atmosphere remained heavy with unsaid secrets as manager Guak and the CEO continued their dinner. Guak leaned in with a surprisingly sharp tone, warning the CEO not to get any strange ideas and reminding him that his only job was to stay quiet and collect his paycheck like everyone else. The CEO simply laughed off the remark, claiming that an old man like himself had long since run out of any real ambition. Guak did not seem entirely convinced, noting that Hiren was the one with the real potential and that they needed to stay focused on their shared goals to get exactly what they wanted. Hiren eventually excused herself from the table, carefully adjusting her professional attire as she prepared to head back to the office. She made it clear that she wanted no misunderstandings about the situation and quietly slipped away into the night. She eventually arrived at her luxury apartment, entering the quiet rooms with a lingering sense of isolation. She wondered if her husband was even home, though she quickly realized that his presence would not change the fact that they had not shared a meaningful cardio connection in years. As she settled into a warm bath to wash away the stress of the day, she reflected on the repetitive nature of her life and felt a growing desire for something to finally change. The following day at the office, Inchul found it physically impossible to focus on his spreadsheets. Ever since he had made the internal decision to approach the team leader, his mind was completely consumed by thoughts of her. He worried that a strict professional like Hiren would never dream of giving a rookie hire any important responsibilities, leaving him stuck at his desk with no way to make his move. His internal struggle was suddenly interrupted when Hiren's voice echoed through the office, calling him by name and catching him completely off guard. He jumped in his seat as she approached his desk, looking as stunning and authoritative as ever. She leaned in and asked him directly what exactly he was hoping to accomplish at the company. Inchul scrambled for a response, stammering about wanting to do his best at work and proving his worth as a dedicated employee. Hiren seemed to consider this for a moment before commanding him to follow her into her private office immediately. Once they were alone, the dynamic shifted as Hiren took a seat on the edge of her desk and looked at him with a mysterious expression. She informed him that his probation period was officially over and that he was being assigned a very specific set of new tasks. She explained that she needed him to act as her personal assistant, following her around and handling her every need like a dedicated secretary. 3 weeks had passed since Inchul began his new life as the personal shadow of team leader Hiren. He walked into her office with a sense of pride, handing over a report that covered every detail she had requested, along with several extra insights he knew she would appreciate. Hiren scanned the documents and admitted that his thoroughness had actually saved her a significant amount of time. Inchul offered a bright smile, promising to start preparations for their next big meeting immediately before making a graceful exit. As he walked away, he felt a surge of confidence, sensing that her professional walls were finally starting to crumble. This progress hadn't come without a cost, as he had spent many long nights hunched over his desk, pushing himself to the absolute limit to prove he was more than just a lucky hire. However, the reality of his exhaustion soon caught up with him, and he slumped into his chair while realizing that an invisible barrier still remained between them. He checked his phone and saw that it was nearly midnight on August 26, and a sudden realization hit him like a lightning bolt. He knew exactly what day it was and understood that this was the perfect moment to finally change their dynamic for good. Inside her private office, Hiren was still lost in the rhythmic clicking of her keyboard, noticing how the building had grown eerily quiet. She reflected on how she had unconsciously become accustomed to having someone around who could actually match her intense work ethic. She had to admit that the rookie was truly incredible at his job, yet she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of suspicion. She remembered that manager Guak had been the one to pick him and wondered if he was really just a hardworking employee or if there was something more calculated behind his average-looking exterior. Her thoughts drifted toward the office rumors, and she found herself feeling a wave of disbelief as she imagined him being so bold with every other woman in the building. She concluded that he must be a bit of a crazy character to try his luck so shamelessly while maintaining such a diligent facade. The silence was broken when the door pushed open and Inchul appeared with a plastic bag filled with cold drinks. Hiren looked up in total confusion, wondering why he was still lingering in the office at such an hour. Inchul didn't miss a beat and reminded her that it was her birthday, explaining that he assumed she would still be working late despite the occasion. Hiren was momentarily speechless, wondering how a new hire could have possibly discovered such a private detail. He simply laughed it off, noting that, as her assistant, it was only natural for him to know these things, and he pointed out that he had even sent her materials early so she could afford to leave work sooner. The atmosphere shifted instantly as Hiren stood up, her face a mask of cold authority. She walked toward him and demanded to know if he truly thought she was a joke or an easy target. She made it clear that she was fully aware of his frequent interactions with the rest of the staff and felt that his current attempt was nothing more than a half-baked move. Inchul felt a cold sweat breaking out as he realized she knew everything, and he briefly worried that his entire life was about to be reset once again. Hiren let out a sharp laugh of disappointment, stating that she had clearly thought too highly of him and now saw him as nothing more than an awkward, indecisive child. She decided to overlook the gesture as a childish mistake, telling him that she now knew exactly who he really was. Inchul felt a surge of silent frustration at being dismissed so easily. In a sudden burst of energy, he reached out and grabbed her arm with a firm grip that caught her completely off guard. He looked her directly in the eyes and told her that she was absolutely wrong about him. Before she could utter another word of criticism, he pulled her into a sudden cardio gesture, proving once and for all that he was finished playing the role of the passive assistant.